Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into one of history's most delicious ironies. Picture this. The year is 1693, and a humble Italian immigrant named Francesco Bianco is selling hot chocolate in London. Within decades, his cozy little shop would transform into White's, the most exclusive, powerful, and ruthlessly snobbish gentlemen's club in the entire world. A place where kings would someday bow, where fortunes would vanish over card games, and where the future of Britain would be decided over brandy and cigars. But here's the twist that'll make you smile. It all started in a place called Mrs. White's Chocolate House. Yes, you heard that right. The most masculine, testosterone-fueled sanctuary in London began with the word Mrs. in its name. If that doesn't make you curious about how absurd this whole story gets, I don't know what will. So before we dive deeper into this wonderfully strange world together, I'd love it if you could hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. But only if tonight's story genuinely speaks to you. And hey, I'm curious, where in the world are you watching this from right now? Are you tucked into bed in Texas? Or maybe winding down after a long day in Toronto? Drop a comment and let me know. Now, dim those lights, get comfortable, maybe turn on a fan for that gentle white noise, and let's step back in time together to discover how grown men created the silliest, most elaborate hideaways in history. London in the late 1600s was a city transforming before everyone's eyes. The Great Fire of 1666 had just finished reshaping the urban landscape, and coffee was becoming the drink of choice for men who wanted to feel sophisticated and worldly. Coffee houses were popping up everywhere, noisy democratic spaces where merchants rubbed shoulders with scholars, where anyone with a penny could buy a cup and join the conversation. They were nicknamed penny universities, because for the price of a coffee, you could listen to the greatest minds debate politics, science, and philosophy. But Francesco Bianco saw an opportunity that others missed. He understood something fundamental about human nature, especially the male variety. Men didn't just want stimulation and conversation, they wanted chocolate. Rich, luxurious, expensive chocolate. And more importantly, they wanted exclusivity. They wanted a place where they could escape, not just from the crowded streets, but from something much closer to home. Their wives, their mothers, and the endless domestic expectations that came with being a proper gentleman. So Francesco opened his chocolate house in Mayfair, and he did something clever. He created an atmosphere. This wasn't just about the beverage, it was about the experience. Comfortable chairs, privacy, a sense that you were part of something special. And in the back room, hidden away from prying eyes, something that would change everything, gambling. You see, gambling was technically illegal in England at this time. The authorities frowned upon it as a moral failing, a path to ruin. But here's where the beautiful absurdity begins. The law had a loophole the size of a carriage. Gambling was perfectly legal inside a private members-only establishment. Francesco Bianco, whether through genius or luck, had stumbled upon the golden ticket. Men could drink chocolate up front, maintaining their respectable facades, but in the back room they could roll dice, play cards, and wager enormous sums of money. All perfectly legal, all perfectly secret. It was rebellion wrapped in respectability. Chaos disguised as civility. Word spread quickly through London's upper classes. The chocolate house became the place to be. Young aristocrats, middle-aged members of parliament, even the occasional royal would show up to sip chocolate and, let's be honest, to gamble away their family fortunes. Francesco was smart enough to know that his real business wasn't chocolate. It was providing a sanctuary where rules bent and consequences felt distant. But here's where the story takes a fascinating turn that reveals something profound about human psychology. These men, these powerful, wealthy, educated gentlemen, weren't just escaping the law. They were escaping something much more suffocating: the rigid expectations of Georgian society. Think about it. If you were an aristocrat in 1700, your entire life was a performance. Every gesture, every word, every outfit was scrutinized. You had to be stoic, dignified, controlled at all times. Your home wasn't really yours. It was a stage where servants watched your every move, where your wife expected you to fulfill your duties as a husband and father, where your children needed guidance and discipline. The chocolate house offered something radical: the freedom to be imperfect, to be loud, to lose control, to make terrible decisions and laugh about them with other men who understood. It was a space where, paradoxically, these men could finally relax by engaging in the most stressful activity imaginable: high-stakes gambling. And they were not gambling small amounts. We're talking about bets that would equal hundreds of thousands of dollars today. The writer Jonathan Swift, who lived through this era, called whites the bane of half the English nobility. That's not exaggeration, that's historical fact. Families were ruined, estates were lost. Men would walk into whites as wealthy landowners and stumble out at dawn penniless and devastated. Yet they kept coming back. Why? Because whites and the clubs that followed offered something more valuable than money: belonging, status, a place in the hierarchy that mattered. If you were a member of whites, you were somebody. You'd arrived. The blackball system, where a single negative vote could destroy your application, made membership intensely desirable. The harder it was to get in, the more desperately men wanted it. By the 1750s, the chocolate had become almost irrelevant. Whites had transformed from Francesco Bianco's humble shop into something far more powerful: an institution. It moved to new premises on St. James's Street, where it remains to this day. The building itself became a symbol. That famous bow window on the ground floor? It would become the throne from which the most fashionable men in England would judge the rest of society. But we'll get to that delicious story later. What's remarkable is how quickly other clubs followed White's model. Brooks's opened in 1762 for the Whigs, the liberal political faction. Boodle's, also in 1762, catered to the country gentleman. Whites became associated with the Tories, the conservative crowd. Suddenly, London had competing sanctuaries, each with its own political flavour, its own personality, its own absurd traditions. And here's something that might surprise you. These clubs weren't just about escaping women. They were about recreating a very specific masculine environment that these men had loved and lost: their boarding school years. Almost every member had been shipped off to places like Eton or Harrow as young boys, where they'd lived in all-male dormitories, formed intense friendships, and learned that life was bearable when you were surrounded by other boys who understood the unspoken rules. The clubs were essentially very expensive, very sophisticated boarding schools for grown men. Same leather chairs, same wood panelling, same sense that the outside world, with all its complications and responsibilities, could be kept at bay. The food reflected this perfectly, though we'll explore that particular absurdity in detail later. For now, just know that these powerful men who ran the British Empire, who controlled vast fortunes, who shaped the destiny of nations, wanted to eat the same comforting dishes their nannies had made them as children: roast beef, puddings, simple, predictable, nostalgic. Food that reminded them of a time before adult responsibilities crashed down on their shoulders. By the late 1700s, St. James's Street had become known as Clubland. Walk down that single street and you'd pass the headquarters of British power. These weren't just social clubs, they were where policies were debated, where political alliances were forged, where the future of the empire was negotiated over port and cigars. One member of parliament literally said that Britain had a system of club government. The clubs had become more influential than parliament itself in many ways. But underneath all this power and influence ran a current of absurdity that never quite disappeared. These were still the places where grown men bet on which raindrop would slide down a window first, where they wagered on whether their friends would still be alive next year, where a man could collapse at the doorstep and members would place bets on whether he was dead or merely unconscious before anyone bothered to help him. The genius of it all, and maybe the tragedy too, was that these clubs managed to be simultaneously important and ridiculous, powerful and petty, dignified and deranged. They were mirrors reflecting both the best and worst of Georgian and Victorian masculinity. The loyalty and friendship, yes, but also the waste, the cruelty, the desperate need to feel superior to someone, anyone. And here's what keeps me fascinated by this history. These clubs still exist. White's is still there on St. James's Street, still exclusive, still refusing to admit women as full members even in 2025. The same building that Francesco Bianco's chocolate house eventually became is still standing, still operating, still maintaining traditions that began more than 3 centuries ago. You can't just walk in, you can't even apply on your own. You need to be proposed by existing members, seconded by others, and then you wait that sometimes 9 years or more, while the membership decides if you're worthy. Think about that. In a world of Amazon Prime and instant gratification, there's still a place where men wait nearly a decade for the privilege of entering a building, where your wealth alone won't get you in, where being blackballed, rejected by a single anonymous negative vote, remains a genuine social catastrophe, where the whole elaborate system continues because enough people believe that exclusivity equals value, that difficulty equals worth, that keeping people out makes being inside more meaningful. So we started tonight with Francesco Bianco selling chocolate, and we've arrived at an insight into human nature itself. We create clubs, groups, tribes, because we desperately want to belong to something bigger than ourselves. We invent elaborate rules and rituals because they give us structure and meaning. And sometimes, just sometimes, we take those rituals so seriously that they become beautifully, wonderfully, absurdly important. But if you think the origin story is strange, just wait until you hear about what happened inside these clubs once they were established. Because the betting reached levels of creative insanity that you won't quite believe. These gentlemen, with all their wealth and education, found ways to gamble on absolutely everything. And I do mean everything. The stories recorded in White's famous betting book read like fever dreams, and in our next part, we're going to explore exactly how far these supposedly dignified gentlemen were willing to go in their quest to combat boredom and prove their cleverness to each other. Trust me, you won't want to miss what comes next. Now imagine walking into White's Club on a quiet evening in 1751. The air smells of tobacco smoke and old leather. Candles flicker against mahogany walls, and there, sitting on a pedestal near the fireplace, is a large leather-bound book. This isn't a guest register or a membership directory. This is something far more revealing about human nature, the betting book. And the entries inside would make you question everything you thought you knew about dignity, class, and common sense. Let me read you an actual entry from April of 1819. Listen to how casually this is written. Sir Joseph Copley bets Mr. Horace Seymour 5 guineas that Lord Temple has a legitimate child before Mr. Neville. 5 guineas, that's roughly $500 today, wagered on which of their friends would produce an heir first. These men were literally betting on their friends' fertility and private lives as casually as you might bet on a football game. Can you imagine your co-workers sitting around the office, placing bets on whose wife would get pregnant first? The human resources nightmare alone makes me shudder. But that bet, strange as it sounds, represents the tame end of the spectrum. Because what happened at these gentlemen's clubs wasn't just gambling, it was a full-blown addiction to uncertainty wrapped in the costume of aristocratic leisure. These men had everything: wealth, land, titles, security. They never had to worry about where their next meal would come from or whether they could afford rent. So they created artificial uncertainty. They invented stakes where none existed. They turned the mundane act of living into a constant series of wagers because without that edge of risk, life felt unbearably boring. The most famous bet in White's history, and this one has been verified by multiple historical sources, involved Lord Alvanley in the early 1800s. Picture a rainy London afternoon. Lord Alvanley is sitting in that legendary bow window we mentioned earlier, watching raindrops trace paths down the glass. He's bored. Monumentally, soul-crushingly bored. And in that moment of aristocratic ennui, he turns to his companion and says something that would cement his place in history. "I'll wager you £3,000 on which raindrop reaches the bottom first." £3,000. In today's money, that's somewhere between $300,000 and $400,000. On raindrops, two grown men, members of the ruling class, with nothing better to do than gamble a fortune on which tiny droplet of water would win a race down a window pane. And here's what gets me. This wasn't considered crazy. It was considered amusing, clever even. The story spread through London society as an example of Alvanley's wit and daring, not his stupidity. But let me tell you about a bet that reveals something much darker about this culture. The historian Horace Walpole, a man who lived through this era and documented it meticulously, recorded an incident that still makes my stomach turn. Two members of White's made a wager about whether a man could survive underwater for 12 hours. Not theoretically, actually. They hired what Walpole called a desperate fellow, presumably someone so poor that risking his life for money seemed like a reasonable option. They sank a ship with this man aboard, and according to Walpole's account, they never heard from him again. The stake was £1,500, roughly $150,000 today. That's what a human life was worth as the entertainment for bored aristocrats. Now, historians debate whether this actually happened, or if it was an exaggerated rumour meant to illustrate how depraved the gambling culture had become. But here's the thing. The fact that people found this story believable tells you everything you need to know about what these clubs had become. And then there are the bets that were simultaneously morbid and mundane. The betting book is filled with wagers about how long specific people would live, not in a general actuarial sense, specific friends and acquaintances. Mr. James bets Mr. Thompson 10 guineas that the Duke of Marlborough lives past Christmas. Can you imagine sitting in your living room looking at your friend and saying, "Bet you $50 old Bob doesn't make it to New Year's"? The psychological gymnastics required to make that seem normal are staggering. What fascinates me is the casual intimacy of these death bets. These weren't strangers. These were men betting on the mortality of people they knew, dined with, spoke to regularly. It suggests a strange emotional distance, a way of turning even the people in your life into abstract concepts, mere variables in an endless series of wagers. Some historians argue this was a coping mechanism. In an era of high mortality rates, where disease could strike anyone at any time, perhaps betting on death was a way of asserting control over the uncontrollable. Others see it as simple callousness, the inevitable result of too much wealth and too little purpose. Let me tell you about one of the most entertaining series of bets in the entire book, and this one actually has a happy ending. It involves Lord Byron, not the famous poet, but his ancestor William Byron, the 5th Baron Byron. Lord Byron was known throughout London for his romantic escapades. The man changed lovers like other people changed hats, and this made him absolutely irresistible as the subject for betting. In September of 1746, Mr. James Jeffreys bet Mr. John Jeffreys 100 guineas, roughly $10,000 today, that Lord Byron would marry a woman named Miss Shaw before Michaelmas of 1748. That's betting on a wedding date 2 years in advance for a man who showed no signs of settling down, but it gets better. A month later, in October, Mr. James Jeffreys bet Mr. Fanshawe 50 guineas that Byron would marry Miss Shaw by Lady Day of the next year, moving the deadline up significantly. Another gentleman, a Captain Draper, jumped in with 5 guineas of his own. Why were they so confident? Nobody knows. Maybe they had inside information. Maybe Miss Shaw's family was pressuring Byron. Maybe they just really believed in true love. But here's the delightful twist. James Jeffreys won both bets. Lord Byron married Elizabeth Shaw on March 28, 1747, just barely making the Lady Day deadline. Somewhere in London, James Jeffreys was celebrating not just his friend's marriage, but his own substantial winnings. I like to imagine him at the wedding, grinning not from joy but from profit. These marriage bets were everywhere in the betting book. Who would marry whom, when they would marry, whether the marriage would last, whether the wife would produce an heir within a year. The private lives of everyone in their social circle became fair game for speculation and profit. And this raises an interesting question. How did the subjects of these bets feel? Were they flattered by the attention, annoyed? Did Lord Byron know that half of White's membership had money riding on his love life? The records don't say, but I suspect he knew. London society was small enough that rumours travelled fast. Now let's talk about the political wagers, because these reveal how intertwined the clubs were with actual power. The betting book contains hundreds of entries about political appointments, elections, and policy decisions. Lord Limerick bets Mr. Broderick 5 guineas that he names the next Lord Lieutenant of Ireland against anyone Mr. Broderick shall name. These men weren't just guessing, they had insider knowledge. They knew who was being considered for positions. They had had conversations with people making decisions. The bets were a way of showing off that knowledge, of proving their proximity to power. During the Napoleonic Wars, the betting book exploded with military wagers. Which side would win specific battles? How long the war would last? Whether Napoleon would successfully invade Britain? These weren't idle speculations. British policy was being shaped by many of the same men placing these bets. Imagine modern senators sitting in a private club wagering on whether legislation they are about to vote on will pass. The conflict of interest is breathtaking. And then there's my personal favourite category, the completely random bets that suggest these men would gamble on literally anything if they were bored enough. The betting book records wagers on which member would die first, which member would marry first, which member's horse would win a race, and I'm not making this up, which member had the most children out of wedlock. That last one must have made for some very awkward dinner conversations. But here's what strikes me most about the betting book. It wasn't secret. It was displayed openly in the club for all members to see. New entries were read aloud, discussed, celebrated. The book was a source of pride, a demonstration of the club's daring and wit. What we might see as tasteless or cruel, they saw as sophisticated entertainment. The ability to remain emotionally detached while wagering on serious matters, life, death, marriage, war, was considered a mark of refinement. There's a psychological phenomenon at work here that still exists today. When you turn life into a game, when you place bets and track odds, you create emotional distance from the actual stakes. Modern stock traders do this. Sports gamblers do this. We're all capable of treating serious matters as abstract when there's money on the line. What makes the Gentlemen's Club special is how openly they embraced it, how they turned emotional detachment into a club virtue. The betting book also served another purpose that I think is often overlooked. It was proof. In an era before written contracts were standard for casual wagers, before lawyers got involved in every transaction, the betting book served as a binding record. If you made a bet and it was recorded in that book, you were honour bound to pay up when the wager was settled. Refusing to honour a bet recorded in the betting book was grounds for expulsion from the club, a social death sentence for men whose entire identity was wrapped up in their membership, and people did pay up, even when it bankrupted them. There are records of men selling estates, dismissing servants, going into massive debt, all to settle gambling debts recorded in that book. Why? Because honour demanded it. Because your reputation, your standing among other gentlemen, was worth more than money. Or at least that's what they told themselves. The reality was probably simpler and sadder. They were addicts, and the social structure of the club enabled their addiction by making it honourable. Sir John Bland, whose story we touched on earlier, lost £32,000 in a single sitting at Brooks's club. That's roughly $3 million in today's money, lost in one night of gambling. He tried to flee to France to escape his creditors, but the shame was too much. He took his own life on the road from Calais to Paris. The tragedy is that his fellow club members probably shook their heads, called it unfortunate, and then placed bets on who would take his seat at the card table. I need you to understand this wasn't aberrant behaviour, this was the norm. The clubs weren't concerned about gambling addiction because they didn't see it as addiction. They saw it as character. A man who could lose a fortune and smile about it. That was strength. A man who could bet on his friend's death without flinching. That was sophistication. The entire value system was inverted from what we'd recognise today. The Betting Book of Whites was published in 1892, nearly 150 years of wagers compiled into 2 volumes. The historian Algernon Henry Burke, who edited these volumes, wrote in his introduction that the book represented a vivid picture of the social and cultural landscape of a bygone era. That's a polite way of saying it revealed how utterly unhinged these supposedly civilized men really were. So why am I telling you all this? Because the betting book isn't just a historical curiosity, it's a mirror. It shows us what happens when people have unlimited resources and limited purpose. When competition becomes everything. When emotional detachment is rewarded and empathy is seen as weakness. Sound familiar? We might not have leather-bound betting books anymore, but we have social media feeds where people compete for likes and follows. We have financial markets where traders bet on everything from weather patterns to political instability. We've just digitized the impulse. The men of Whites would have understood modern gambling culture perfectly. The apps, the odds, the fantasy leagues, the sports betting, the cryptocurrency speculation, they would have recognized all of it as variations on their own obsessions. They pioneered the idea that life is more interesting when you have money riding on the outcome, that anything can be improved by adding stakes. We're still living with that legacy. But we've also hopefully learned something they never quite figured out, that turning everything into a wager comes with a cost. That emotional distance can become emotional emptiness, that the constant pursuit of stakes, of risks, of that gambling high can hollow you out until you're betting on raindrops because nothing else feels real anymore. The Betting Book of Whites closed in 1878, though gambling at the clubs continued long after. The tradition of recording every wager faded, probably because even the Victorian sensibilities eventually recognised how the book revealed. But the impulse, that fundamental human desire to make life more exciting through artificial risk, that never went away. And speaking of impulses that never went away, There's one particular tradition at these clubs that makes the betting seem almost rational by comparison. Because as absurd as it is to wager on raindrops, it's even more absurd to create an entire social system where a single anonymous vote can destroy a man's reputation forever. The blackball system wasn't just about keeping people out, it was about exercising pure, unaccountable power. And in our next part, we're going to explore exactly how this system worked, who it destroyed, and why some clubs still practice it today. There's a small wooden box that sits in the committee room of the most traditional gentlemen's clubs. Elegant, unassuming, with 2 compartments inside. One holds white balls, the other holds black balls. And this innocent-looking box has destroyed more lives, ruined more careers, and caused more heartbreak than perhaps any other piece of furniture in a British history. Because when you were blackballed, when that single black sphere appeared among the white, you weren't just rejected from a club, you were erased from society itself. Let me paint you a picture of how this worked, because the psychology of it is absolutely fascinating. Imagine you're a young gentleman in 1830. You've got money, education, good family connections. You desperately want to join White's or Brooks because that's where everything happens. The conversations that matter, the connections that advance careers, the subtle nod of approval that tells the world you've made it. So you find 2 current members willing to sponsor you. They vouch for your character. Your application is submitted. And then you wait. The waiting period varied by club, but it was never short. At some clubs, your name would be posted publicly for weeks, giving any member time to object. At others, like Pratt's, the process was even more mysterious. You might not even know when your application was being considered. The uncertainty alone was torture. You'd walk past the club on St. James's Street, looking at those grand windows, wondering if the men inside were discussing your fate at that very moment. Finally, the day arrives. The election committee meets. This committee, typically 20 members with 5 forming a quorum, holds your entire social future in their hands. Each member is given access to that box I mentioned. In private, in silence, each man reaches in and selects either a white ball for approval or a black ball for rejection. They drop their choice into a separate collection box. Nobody sees which ball you chose. Nobody can trace it back to you. The anonymity is absolute. Here's where it gets brutal. At Boodle's, the rule was clear. 10 white balls were needed for every single black ball. If you got 19 white balls and 2 black balls, you were rejected. At Pratt's, even harsher, 1 black ball in a quorum of 5 excluded you immediately. Just one. One person, maybe someone who didn't like your father 30 years ago. Maybe someone who thought you looked at them wrong once. Maybe someone who just woke up in a bad mood that day, could end your dreams with a single anonymous gesture, and you'd never know why. That's the part that would drive you mad. The club would simply inform you that your application was unsuccessful. No explanation, no appeal, no chance to defend yourself or correct whatever misunderstanding might have occurred. You were just out permanently, because once blackballed you couldn't reapply. The decision was final. The psychological warfare of this system is extraordinary. The anonymity meant suspicion fell on everyone. Was it Lord So-and-so, who seemed friendly but perhaps harboured secret resentment? Was it that quiet member in the corner you'd never even spoken to? The paranoia could consume you. Men would spend years trying to figure out who had blackballed them, pursuing theories, analysing old interactions, driving themselves half mad with speculation. Let me tell you about one of the most famous blackballing incidents in history, and it involves royalty. The Prince of Wales, the future King George IV, was a member of Brooks's club and deeply fond of it. One of his closest friends and confidants was a man named Jack Payne. The prince assumed, naturally, that his friend would be welcomed into Brooks with open arms. Royal endorsement was usually enough to guarantee admission anywhere, but when Jack Payne's application came up for vote, someone dropped a black ball, just one, in a room full of men who knew exactly who the prince's closest friend was. Someone had the audacity to reject him anonymously. The prince was furious. Not just angry, genuinely, royally furious. He demanded to know who had blackballed his friend. The club, bound by its sacred rules of anonymity, refused to tell him. Even the future king couldn't break the code of silence. So the Prince of Wales did something dramatic and very public. He resigned his membership from Brooks's. He switched his allegiance to White's, Brooks's great rival. The message was clear. You humiliate my friend, you lose your royal patron. And here's the delicious irony. Brooks's didn't beg him to come back. They didn't apologize or make exceptions. The rules were the rules, even for princes. That single black ball cost Brooks's its most prestigious member, and they accepted it as the price of maintaining their system. Now, think about what this tells us about power. The Prince of Wales, one of the most powerful men in England, couldn't override a single anonymous vote from a club member whose name we'll never know. In that moment, that unknown member wielded more power than royalty. The blackball system created a strange democracy of destruction. Anyone could veto anyone, regardless of rank or title, as long as they were already inside the club. But why would someone blackball an applicant? The reasons were as varied as human pettiness itself. Sometimes it was political, Tories blackballing Whigs, Conservatives blocking Liberals. Sometimes it was personal, old family feuds, business disputes, romantic rivalries. Sometimes it was social, new money being rejected by old money, tradesmen kept out by aristocrats. And sometimes, I suspect, it was pure spite. The intoxicating knowledge that you could ruin someone's day, maybe their whole year, maybe their entire life, with a single anonymous gesture. One member of the Garrick Club, another famous London establishment, later confessed in his private diary that he'd blackballed someone simply because the man had once taken his favourite chair in the reading room. That's it. No grand reason, no moral objection, just territorial pettiness elevated to life-altering consequence. And because of the anonymity, he never faced any backlash. The rejected man probably spent years wondering what he'd done wrong, never guessing it was about a chair. The waiting lists at exclusive clubs could stretch for 9 years or longer, and this wasn't accidental. It was deliberate strategy. The longer the wait, the more desperate you became, the more you demonstrate your commitment through patience. But it also meant that even after waiting nearly a decade, you could still be blackballed on the day of your vote. Imagine investing 9 years of hope and anticipation, telling your friends you'd soon be a member, building your entire social identity around the assumption of acceptance, and then receiving that cold letter of rejection with no explanation. Some men never recovered. There are documented cases of applicants who became reclusive after being blackballed, who left London entirely, who descended into depression or alcoholism. Because being rejected wasn't just personal, it was public. Everyone in your social circle knew you'd applied. They'd ask about it. So, when's your election? And you'd have to admit you'd been rejected. The shame was crushing. The clubs themselves had no guilt about this system. They saw it as essential quality control. In an 1829 edition of a club etiquette guide, the author wrote, "The blackball, though painful to those who experience it, serves a vital function in preserving the character and tone of an establishment. One unsuitable member can poison the atmosphere for all." Notice the language. Unsuitable, not immoral or criminal, just unsuitable. Not fitting in was crime enough. And what made someone unsuitable? The criteria were never written down because that would make them challengeable. It was all based on feeling, on instinct, on whether you gave off the right vibe. Did you dress correctly? Did you laugh at the right jokes? Were you educated at the right schools? Did your father belong to the right clubs? Did you carry yourself with the proper mixture of confidence and deference? All these intangible qualities were being judged, and you'd never know which one you'd failed. Women, of course, couldn't even apply. That was a blackball before you started. The question of female membership wasn't up for debate until the 1980s, and we'll talk about that particular absurdity later. But even among eligible men, white, wealthy, well-connected men, the blackball cut deep. Here's something that still happens today, even in clubs that have nominally modernized. When you propose for membership at White's or Boodle's or Brooks's, your proposers, the men sponsoring you, take on a social risk. If you're blackballed, it reflects poorly on their judgment. So the real screening happens before you ever reach the election committee. Your potential sponsors will quietly sound out other members. What do you think of so-and-so? If they sense any hesitation, any hint that a blackball might appear, they'll politely decline to sponsor you. You never even get to the voting stage. The blackball happens in whisper conversations months before the actual ballot. This creates a system where only the safest, most uncontroversial candidates ever reach the voting stage, which means the clubs become echo chambers, populated by people who think alike, look alike, come from similar backgrounds. The blackball system doesn't just exclude individuals, it excludes entire categories of difference. It's social engineering disguised as democratic voting. The brilliant part, if we can call it brilliant, is how the system makes everyone complicit. Even if you personally would never blackball someone, you benefit from the exclusivity that blackballing creates. The club remains prestigious precisely because it's so hard to join, so even the members who feel uncomfortable with the system have an incentive to maintain it. Your membership is more valuable when other people are kept out. And let's talk about what happened when someone violated the code of silence. Because occasionally, in the heat of argument or after too much port, a member would let slip who had blackballed whom. The consequences were severe. The member who revealed the secret would face censure or even expulsion. The blackballer, now exposed, would face social ostracism from the very person they'd rejected. The whole elegant system depended on perfect anonymity, and when that broke down, it created feuds that could last generations. There's a documented case from Brooks's in the 1850s where one member, convinced he knew who'd blackballed his friend, challenged the suspected blackballer to a duel. The suspected man refused, maintaining he'd done no such thing, and we'll never know if he was lying or genuinely innocent. The accuser was eventually asked to leave the club for disrupting the peace. The unwritten rule was clear. You could blackball with impunity, but you couldn't accuse anyone of blackballing without proof, and proof was impossible by design. Some clubs tried to reform the system over the years. They'd change the ratios, maybe requiring 3 blackballs instead of 1, or 5 blacks for every 20 whites. But they never eliminated it entirely, because the blackball was the heart of the system. It's what made membership meaningful. In an age when money could buy almost anything, the blackball ensured that the clubs remained one thing money alone couldn't purchase. Compare this to modern cancel culture, and you'll see the same dynamics playing out. Anonymous accusations, no due process, permanent consequences, impossible to defend yourself. The medium has changed. We use social media instead of ballot boxes. But the human impulse is identical. The rush of power that comes from destroying someone's reputation without having to face them directly. The clubs perfected this art form 2 centuries before Twitter existed. By the Victorian era, being blackballed from a major club was considered such a catastrophe that men would take extreme measures as to avoid it. Some would withdraw their applications at the last minute if they heard rumours of opposition. Others would apply to less prestigious clubs first, building a track record of acceptability before attempting the really exclusive establishments. The whole system created a hierarchy of belonging that was as rigid as any caste system. And here's what keeps me up at night thinking about this. The system worked. For the clubs, it absolutely worked. They maintained their exclusivity for centuries. They retained their prestige. They controlled access to power. The black ball, as cruel and arbitrary as it was, achieved exactly what it was designed to achieve. Which means we can't simply dismiss it as stupid or irrational. It was coldly, brutally effective. But at what cost? How many talented, interesting, worthy people were excluded because one person had a grudge? How much did British society lose because the places where decisions were made and connections were formed remained artificially narrow? How many perspectives were never heard in those wood-panelled rooms because the black ball kept them out? We'll never know, because the excluded don't leave historical records. They disappear from history as completely as if that black ball had erased them from existence. The black ball still exists today at 8 clubs in London. White's, Brooks's, Boodle's, Buck's, Pratt's, the Travellers' Club, the Beefsteak and the East India Club. The exact voting procedures are secret, because of course they are, but the principle remains. One no can override a dozen yeses. The power to exclude remains absolute and anonymous. So when you're drifting off to sleep tonight, consider this uncomfortable truth. The black ball system shows us something fundamental about human nature. Given the chance to exercise power without accountability, even supposedly civilized people will use it cruelly. The gentlemen of London, with all their education and refinement, created one of the most psychologically devastating social mechanisms in history, and they were proud of it. But if you think the black ball was absurd, wait until you hear about one particular club's naming convention. Because at Pratt's, there's a tradition so delightfully silly, so completely unnecessary, that it makes blackballing look almost rational by comparison. In this tiny basement establishment, something extraordinary happens with names, and the reasoning behind it reveals yet another layer of how these gentlemen convinced themselves that ridiculous traditions were actually essential refinements. Picture a narrow townhouse on Park Place just off St James's Street. From the outside it looks modest, even shabby compared to the palatial buildings housing White's or Brooks. No grand entrance, no impressive columns, just a plain black door with a simple brass plaque. This is Pratt's Club, and it might be the strangest establishment in all of London, because inside this unassuming building, 600 of Britain's most powerful men compete for 14 dinner seats in a basement, and every single waiter who serves them answers to exactly the same name, George. Yes, you heard that correctly. George. Every male waiter is George, not a George or George Smith or George number 3, just George. All of them. And when you need something, more wine, another serving, help with your coat, you simply call out George, and whichever waiter is nearest responds as if you specifically meant him. Now, before you ask the obvious question, let me tell you what happened when Pratt's hired their first female staff member in the 1980s, breaking over a century of tradition. They faced a genuine dilemma. The George system was sacred, but she was, inconveniently, not male. So they solved it with the kind of logic that only makes sense inside these clubs. They called her Georgina. Problem solved, apparently. The tradition continues, slightly modified but fundamentally intact. And if you're thinking this is the most absurd thing you've heard so far tonight, well, we're just getting started with Pratt's peculiarities. The club was founded in 1857 by a man named William Nathaniel Pratt, who wasn't even the Duke or Earl of anything. He was a steward, essentially a household manager, working for Henry Somerset, the 6th Duke of Beaufort. Pratt lived at 14 Park Place, and the Duke would occasionally bring friends over for dinner. The food was good, the company was comfortable, and pretty soon these informal gatherings became regular events. When Pratt died in 1860, his widow Sophia and son Edwin kept the tradition going. Eventually, the 11th Duke of Devonshire bought the property, and it's remained in the Devonshire family ever since. But here's what makes Pratt's architecturally absurd. The main dining room is in the basement. Not a grand basement with high ceilings and elegant proportions, a genuine low-ceilinged basement. And the dinner table seats exactly 14 people, not 13, not 15, 14. In a club with approximately 600 members, let's do the math together. If every member wanted to dine at the club just once a year, and you could somehow organise perfect scheduling with no empty seats, you'd still need to run dinner service nearly 43 times per year for once-a-year attendance. The reality is even more constrained. Dinner at Pratt's is served only in the evenings, and you can't reserve your seat weeks in advance. It's first come, first served, so members genuinely compete for those 14 chairs. Imagine being Lord So-and-so, having paid thousands of pounds in membership fees, and being told, sorry, the table's full because you arrived 15 minutes too late. The exclusivity isn't just about who gets into the club, it's about who gets to use the club they're already in. And what else does this tiny establishment contain? The club has exactly 2 main rooms. The basement dining room we've discussed, and a sitting room/smoking room on the ground floor. There's also a billiard room, and this detail absolutely delights me, it's primarily used for hanging coats on the chairs, not for playing billiards, for coat storage. They have a room with a billiard table that functions as an elaborate closet. The logic, presumably, is that the table keeps the coats elevated and prevents them from getting dusty on the chairs. But nobody says, let's go play billiards. They say, let's go hang our coats on the chairs in the room that happens to contain a billiard table. There's a larger dining room used occasionally for lunches or private parties, a small suite that members can book well in advance for overnight stays, and the steward's quarters above everything else. That's it. That's the entire club. You could walk through the whole building in 5 minutes. White's has multiple floors, grand staircases, rooms dedicated to different purposes. Brooks's has elegant libraries and spacious card rooms. Pratt's has a basement and a coat storage room with a billiard table. So why would anyone want to join? Why would powerful politicians, business titans, and even former prime ministers like Harold Macmillan, David Cameron and John Major fight for membership in such a cramped, inconvenient space? Because that's exactly the point. The inconvenience is the exclusivity, the absurdity is the appeal. Think about it from a psychological perspective. These are men who can afford anything. They dine at Michelin-starred restaurants. They own estates with dozens of rooms. They're never told, sorry, we're full anywhere else in their lives. Pratt's offers them something money can't usually buy, the experience of being denied, of having to wait, of potentially not getting what they want, even though they're members. It's artificial scarcity, elevated to an art form. And that George tradition, it's genius really, from a certain twisted perspective. The stated reason is to avoid confusion. If you don't have to remember individual names, service is simpler. Just call George and George appears. But the real reason, I think, is something deeper. It's about maintaining psychological distance between members and staff. If you know someone's name, their actual individual name, they become a person to you. You might feel obligated to remember details about them, ask how they're doing, treat them as humans deserving individual consideration. But if everyone is George, then no one is anyone. They're interchangeable parts of the service mechanism. You can be perfectly polite to George while simultaneously not seeing George as a distinct individual. It's a brilliant way to maintain class boundaries while pretending you're being egalitarian. We call them all George so we don't have to deal with the complex humanity of having multiple staff members with different names and personalities. When that first woman was hired as Georgina, I imagine the committee meeting must have been something to witness. You can almost hear the conversation. "Gentlemen, we have a situation. We've hired a female staff member, but our George tradition is sacred. What do we do?" Someone probably suggested abandoning the tradition. Horrified gasps all around. Someone else suggested not hiring women at all. Too late for that. Then some genius in the back says, "What about Georgina?" And suddenly the problem is solved. The tradition continues, barely modified, and everyone congratulates themselves on being progressive while changing as little as possible. It's the same impulse we saw with the blackball system. Find a way to appear to adapt while fundamentally preserving the status quo. And it worked. To this day, male waiters at Pratt's are George and female staff are Georgina. The members probably think they're being inclusive by having any female staff at all. Never mind that the naming system still others them, still makes them fit into a framework designed for men. But let's talk about what it's actually like to dine in that basement. I've read accounts from members, always anonymous because Pratt's doesn't believe in publicity, and they describe it as simultaneously intimate and strange. 14 men sitting around one table means you can't have private conversations. Everything's communal. You might sit next to a cabinet minister discussing policy, or a business magnate closing a deal, or just another member wanting to eat his roast beef in peace. The forced proximity creates a peculiar dynamic. You can't ignore each other. You can't retreat into your newspaper and pretend you're alone. You're in it together, whether you like each other or not. This is actually a relic of how the club started. Informal dinners at William Pratt's house, everyone seated together, family style. But maintaining that format in a formal club setting creates something unique. At White's or Brooker's you can dine alone or in small groups, largely ignoring other members. At Pratt's, dining is inherently social, inherently communal, which means if there is someone at that table you can't stand, your options are limited. Either skip dinner or learn to be civil. The forced intimacy probably creates both deep friendships and simmering resentments. And remember, this is a club that didn't admit women as members until 2023. That's not a typo. 2023, 166 years of male-only membership before they finally, reluctantly, voted to allow female members under pressure from the current Duke of Devonshire, who owns the property. Even then, they've only admitted 2 or 3 women out of 600 members. The club is still effectively male-only in practice, even if the rules have technically changed on paper. Here's what strikes me most about Pratt's. It's the distilled essence of what these clubs are really about. Strip away the grand architecture of White's, the political history of Brooks's, the libraries and card rooms and meeting halls. What do you have? A group of men who want to eat dinner together without women, without outsiders, without having to acknowledge the complexity of the world beyond that basement. Pratt's accomplishes this with brutal efficiency. No grand statements needed. Just 14 chairs and a bunch of Georges. The club also has no website. None. In 2025, when your grandmother probably has a Facebook page and toddlers have tablet computers, Pratt's refuses to exist online. If you want to learn about membership, you have to know someone who's already a member. There's no application form you can download. No email address for inquiries. It's word of mouth only, as if we're still living in 1860. This isn't because they're technologically incompetent, it's a choice. A statement that says if you need to look us up, you're not the kind of person who belongs here. The inaccessibility is the point, the inconvenience is the appeal, and honestly, it works. The lack of public information makes Pratt's more mysterious, more desirable. Every article written about the club emphasizes how little is known, how secretive it is, how hard to access. free publicity through deliberate obscurity. Let's talk about who actually belongs to this absurd establishment. Past members include political heavyweights across the Conservative spectrum: Harold Macmillan, Duncan Sandys, Randolph Churchill, David Cameron, John Major. The club doesn't have an explicit political affiliation, but the membership veers towards the right, as one historian diplomatically phrased it. What this means in practice is that Pratt's has been a venue where Conservative Party policy gets hashed out over port and roast beef, where political alliances are formed and destroyed, where prime ministers past and future gather to eat in a basement and be served by people named George. The novelist Robert Galbraith, that's J.K. Rowling's pseudonym, used Pratt's as a setting in her detective novel Lethal White. Her character, Private Detective Cormoran Strike, meets a politician there to discuss a blackmail case. When Rowling's team tried to get permission to photograph the interior for research, they were rudely declined. The staff member who answered the door, probably named George, was apparently quite angry that Rowling had written about the club without asking permission first. "I am the Frenchman in Chapter 9, he reportedly said. J.K. Rowling did not ask permission. Even one of the world's most cited authors, with millions of readers and enormous cultural influence, couldn't get access to photograph at a coat rack in the billiard room. The club's secrecy is non-negotiable. They'd rather be portrayed in fiction by an annoyed author working from second-hand descriptions than compromise their privacy by allowing a few photographs." This tells you everything about the club's priorities. Privacy trumps publicity, always and forever. The membership fee. Nobody will confirm on record, but estimates suggest it's several £1,000s for entry and several thousand more annually. For that money, you get access to a basement dining room where you might not find a seat, a smoking room you share with dozens of others, and the privilege of being served by someone named George. Objectively, this is terrible value for money. A fraction of that cost could get you membership at a modern private club with gyms, spas, meeting rooms, and actual availability. But that misses the point entirely. The value isn't in the amenities. It's in the story you get to tell. It's in the knowledge that you're part of something so exclusive that even having money isn't enough. It's in the absurd traditions that continue simply because they've always continued. When you're at a dinner party and someone asks where you're a member, saying Pratt's carries weight. It signals that you're not just wealthy, you're connected, you're in. You're one of the people who understand why calling everyone George somehow makes sense. There's a beautiful irony in Pratt's existence. It started as the opposite of exclusive, informal dinners at a steward's house, friends gathering casually. But by preserving that informality as formal tradition, by keeping the small scale and intimate setting as membership expanded to 600, they accidentally created something far more exclusive than the grand clubs. At White's, you can at least imagine walking into that grand building sitting in that famous bow window. At Pratt's, 14 chairs. That's it. The laws of mathematics guarantee that you probably can't eat there even if you're a member. And yet, or perhaps therefore, the waiting list to join Pratt's is years long. Men in their 50s apply knowing they might not gain entry until they're in their 60s. They sponsor younger colleagues understanding that those men will be middle-aged before they're admitted. The long wait isn't a bug, it's a feature. It proves commitment. It separates those who merely want to join from those who truly belong. So as you're drifting off to sleep tonight, consider the strange comfort that tradition provides, even absurd tradition. The members of Pratt's could vote to change any of these rules. They could add more chairs, hire more staff with different names, create a website, open up membership. But they won't because the absurdity is the point. The inconvenience is the appeal. The tradition, however silly, is what makes Pratt's Pratt's, and if you think 14 dinner chairs is restrictive, wait until you hear about the dress codes at these establishments. Because while Pratt's limits your physical access to the club, the dress codes at gentlemen's clubs limit something even more fundamental: your ability to express individuality through clothing. The rules about what you can and cannot wear reveal a whole other dimension of control, and some of these regulations are so specific, so arbitrary, that they make calling everyone George seem positively reasonable by comparison. The year is 1895, and a young gentleman stands outside Brooks's club, heart pounding. He's wearing what he believes is appropriate-attire, well-cut jacket, pressed trousers, polished shoes. But the doorman, that immovable guardian of standards, takes one look at his footwear and shakes his head. "I'm afraid those won't do, sir." The young man looks down at his perfectly respectable leather shoes, confused. "What's wrong with them?" The doorman's expression suggests he's just asked why water is wet. "They have buckles, sir. We require laces on Tuesdays." The man stammers something about not knowing there were day-specific shoe fastening requirements. The doorman remains unmoved. "Perhaps you'd like to return when properly attired, sir." And just like that, months of anticipation for his first club visit evaporate because his shoes close the wrong way. I need to be clear about something. This specific anecdote might be apocryphal, embellished over decades of retelling. But here's what's absolutely true. The dress codes at traditional gentlemen's clubs are so detailed, so specific, so utterly arbitrary, that stories like this are completely plausible. Because when you dig into the actual written rules and unwritten expectations, you discover a system of sartorial control that would make fashion police look like anarchists. Let's start with the basics, which aren't basic at all. A 1929 etiquette guide for gentlemen's clubs states, "Members must wear a jacket and collared shirt with tie in all communal areas. Tailored trousers are required. Jeans, shorts, athletic wear, and other similar casual attire are strictly prohibited at all times." Seems straightforward enough, right? But wait, what exactly constitutes tailored trousers? Are we talking about the presence of a seam, a particular fit, the involvement of an actual tailor in their creation? One club historian attempted to define it. Tailored trousers would exclude pajamas, dungarees, overtrousers, combat pants, jogging or tracksuit bottoms, and so forth. The defining characteristic of tailoring might be the presence of a seam and a reasonable attempt at a fit to the wearer. Notice the language, a reasonable attempt at a fit. Who decides what's reasonable? The doorman? A committee? Is there a measurement involved? The vagueness is deliberate because it allows for subjective enforcement. Your trousers might be considered acceptably tailored one day and rejected the next, depending on who's making the judgment. And let's talk about jeans for a moment, because the jean prohibition reveals so much about class anxiety. It doesn't matter if you're wearing designer jeans that cost £500. Doesn't matter if they're perfectly clean, expertly tailored, indistinguishable from expensive trousers except for the fabric. They're still jeans, and jeans are associated with manual labour, with Americans, with casualness, with, heaven forbid, democracy. One club secretary, when pressed on why designer jeans weren't acceptable, responded, "Because they're still fundamentally workwear, regardless of the price tag." The subtext being, we can tell you're trying to dress up clothing meant for the working class, and we're not fooled. But the real absurdity emerges in the details that aren't written down, the unwritten rules that trip up new members and provide endless opportunities for subtle humiliation. Take ties, for instance. The written rule says you must wear a tie. But which tie? Certain clubs have approved colours and patterns, others forbid anything too bold or attention-seeking. One member of the Travellers' Club reported being asked to change his tie because it featured small palm trees considered too whimsical for lunch, apparently. He'd worn it to dinner the previous week without issue, but lunch required more restraint. Why? Nobody could articulate a reason. That's just how it was. The smart casual Friday phenomenon deserves special attention because it's a masterclass in how these institutions pretend to relax while changing virtually nothing. At many clubs, Fridays and weekends allow for smart casual dress. What does this mean in practice? You can remove your tie, that's it. That's the grand relaxation of standards. You still need the jacket, still need the collared shirt, still need the tailored trousers and leather shoes. You've just been granted permission to leave a small strip of silk at home. It's like being told you can break one rule from a list of 50 and considering this freedom. Some clubs go even further with their Friday flexibility. You can wear a smart pullover instead of a jacket. But what makes a pullover smart versus casual? The absence of holes, presumably. The presence of natural fibers rather than synthetic. The right neckline. V-neck is acceptable. Crew neck is questionable. Turtleneck is definitely out. And God help you if you show up in a cardigan. One member reported being told his cardigan, while technically a pullover, was too grandfatherish for the demographic we're cultivating. He was 68 years old. Now let me tell you about Boodles and the chamber pot situation, because it perfectly encapsulates how these clubs handle the collision between tradition and modernity. For years after modern plumbing was installed throughout the building, Boodles kept chamber pots in a small lobby overlooking St. James's Street. The official reason: for the benefit of those members whose habits were formed before the days of modern sanitation. Translation: old members who couldn't be bothered to walk to the new bathrooms could still relieve themselves in pots, as they'd done their entire lives. This wasn't the dirty room, by the way. That delightful terminology was reserved for the undress dining room, a space where members could dine in slightly more casual attire, meaning they could remove their jackets after 6 post-meridium. The chamber pots were in a different area entirely, positioned so that members could use them while gazing out at the street, presumably contemplating the decline of standards among pedestrians below. The fact that this arrangement continued decades into the 20th century tells you everything about how these clubs prioritize tradition over common sense. The shoe question opens up an entire universe of absurdity. Leather shoes are required, but what constitutes a shoe versus a boot? Oxford shoes are always acceptable. Brogues are acceptable except when they're not. Too much decorative perforating can push them into excessive ornamentation territory. Loafers are controversial. Some clubs allow them, others consider them too casual. Monk straps, shoes that fasten with a buckle rather than laces, occupy a strange liminal space where there are technically leather shoes, but somehow suspect. And then there are trainers, or sneakers if you're American. The prohibition against them is absolute, universal and vehement. It doesn't matter if they're pristine white leather sneakers that cost £300. Doesn't matter if they're endorsed by athletes or celebrities. They are athletic footwear. And athletic footwear suggests physical exertion, which suggests work, which suggests you're the sort of person who actually does things, rather than simply owning things. One club solved the trainer problem ingeniously. They keep a stock of loaner shoes at the entrance. If you arrive in unacceptable footwear, they'll lend you proper shoes. Imagine the walk of shame, putting on communal shoes because yours aren't good enough. The irony of all these dress codes is that they are simultaneously incredibly specific and maddeningly vague. You must wear a tie, but not just any tie. You must wear tailored trousers, but the definition of tailored is whatever the doorman says it is. Your clothes must not cause offence, but who decides what's offensive? There's no appeal process, no written standard you can point to. It's feudalism dressed up as etiquette. Let me share a story from a Reddit user who visited a London gentleman's club as a guest in 2018. He'd done his research, worn a suit and tie, felt confident, but he'd brought a backpack. A nice leather backpack, mind you, not a hiking pack, because he had work materials he might need later. The doorman informed him that bags had to be checked at the entrance. All bags, when he asked if he could keep just his wallet and phone. The doorman explained that phones should ideally remain in the cloakroom as well, as their use was discouraged in public areas. The man asked where he should keep his asthma inhaler, which he might need urgently. The doorman thought for a moment and said, "I suppose you could keep that in your pocket, sir, but please be discreet if you need to use it." Discreet about a medical device, the implication being that visible health conditions were somehow poor form. This obsession with controlling appearance extends even to things you wouldn't think matter. Hair length has been a source of controversy at various clubs. In the 1960s and 70s, longer hair on men was considered rebellious and therefore unacceptable. Members who grew their hair past their collar were asked to cut it or faced social ostracism. By the 1990s, shoulder-length hair was still frowned upon, though technically allowed if tied back. Today, most clubs don't have explicit hair length rules, but there's still an expectation that you'll conform to conservative standards. Ponytails on men, technically permissible but socially discouraged. Man buns, you might as well announce you're joining a commune. Facial hair has its own complicated history. For much of the 19th century, elaborate beards and moustaches were fashionable and therefore acceptable. By the mid-20th century, clean-shaven became the standard. Today, beards are back in fashion, and most clubs have accepted them, but with limits. Your beard must be well-groomed. What does that mean? Nobody knows exactly, but you'll know it when someone tells you yours isn't. The most fascinating aspect of these dress codes is how they create a visual uniformity that reinforces social uniformity. When everyone is wearing the same basic outfit, dark suit, white shirt, conservative tie, leather shoes, individual personality gets subsumed into collective identity. You become interchangeable parts of the club aesthetic. This is absolutely intentional. The clubs don't want you to stand out. They want you to fit in. The dress code is a daily reminder that your individuality matters less than your membership in the group. And yet, within these strict boundaries, men found ways to signal status and taste. The quality of your suit's fabric, the subtlety of your tie's pattern, the craftsmanship of your shoes, the fit of your shirt. These tiny variations became the language through which members communicated their sophistication. It's like prison inmates making shanks from toothbrushes. When you're not allowed much, you maximize what you have. The clubs created such restrictive dress codes that members developed an entire vocabulary of mite distinctions invisible to outsiders but screaming volumes to fellow members. Club secretaries will defend these dress codes with remarkable passion. Captain Peter Mirison of Buck's Club explained it this way in an interview. The dress code maintains standards. It ensures that members and guests feel comfortable in a refined environment. It's not about exclusion, it's about excellence. But of course it's about exclusion, that's the entire point. If everyone could meet the dress code, it wouldn't serve its purpose. The codes exist precisely to exclude people who don't instinctively understand what's expected, who didn't grow up learning these rules, who can't afford the specific types of clothing required. There's also a generational component to all this that creates fascinating tension. Older members who followed these rules for 50 years genuinely believe they're important. They see the dress code as maintaining standards against the encroaching tide of casual slovenliness they perceive in modern society. Younger members, even wealthy ones from appropriate backgrounds, sometimes chafe at the restrictions. They've grown up in a world where Mark Zuckerberg runs Facebook in a hoodie, where billionaires wear jeans to board meetings. The idea that shoe choice indicates moral character seems increasingly absurd. But here's where it gets psychologically interesting. Many younger members, after initially resisting, come to embrace the dress codes. Not because they suddenly believe ties are important, but because following the rules becomes part of their identity. It's a form of conspicuous discipline. Yes, I could wear jeans anywhere else, the thinking goes, but I choose not to here. I'm part of something that requires sacrifice. That makes me special. The restriction becomes the appeal. Some clubs have attempted to modernize their dress codes without abandoning them entirely. They've introduced business casual as a category, usually meaning you can skip the tie if you wear a blazer. They've clarified that tailored trousers includes chinos in some cases. They've acknowledged that absolute prohibitions on specific items might be too rigid for the 21st century. But these modifications happen glacially slowly, debated in committee meetings, voted on with the same seriousness as actual policy decisions. The Reform Club, which was first among the traditional clubs to admit women as equal members in 1981, faced a unique dress code challenge. What do you require women to wear when your entire code was designed for men? They settled on business attire for women, which is delightfully vague. The male equivalent requires specific items: jacket, tie, trousers. The female equivalent requires professionalism. The vagueness reveals how little thought had been given to the possibility of female members for nearly 150 years. And let's be honest about what these dress codes really communicate. Class warfare conducted through fabric. When you require clothing that must be dry cleaned, that must be tailored, that must be replaced if it shows wear, you're requiring a certain level of income. When you prohibit clothing associated with physical labor or casual comfort, you're saying, we know you don't work with your hands, and we know you can afford to be uncomfortable. The dress codes are a daily authentication ritual, proving you belong through what you wear. Think about this as you drift towards sleep tonight. These grown men, running countries and corporations, spend mental energy worrying whether their tie is too bold or their shoes too casual. They submit to judgment about their trouser seams. They accept that someone else gets to decide if their clothing causes offense. And they do all this voluntarily, even paying thousands of pounds per year for the privilege. The dress codes reveal something profound about human psychology. Our desperate need to belong can make us accept almost any restriction, tolerate almost any absurdity, as long as it means we're in and others are out. But if you think the dress codes are the height of arbitrary control, you haven't heard about the sleeping traditions yet. Because while the clubs police what you wear, they also have elaborate rules and customs around what you do once you're inside, specifically how you're allowed to nap. And trust me, the art of the gentleman's club nap is a rabbit hole of peculiarity that makes dress codes look almost sensible by comparison. Walk into the library of Brooks's Club on any given afternoon, and you'll witness one of the most delightfully absurd sights in all of London. Elderly gentlemen impeccably dressed in suits and ties sound asleep in leather armchairs with newspapers carefully draped over their faces like paper tents. They're not hiding. They're not being discreet. This is an established tradition, refined over centuries, with its own unwritten etiquette and elaborate justifications. Because at these gentlemen's clubs, sleeping isn't just tolerated, it's practically an art form. The newspaper technique deserves special attention because it's engineering masquerading as tradition. You take your Times or Telegraph, open it to the middle spread, and prop it up to create a peaked roof over your face. This serves multiple purposes simultaneously. First, it blocks the light, which is essential for proper napping. Second, it signals to others that you're sleeping and shouldn't be disturbed. Third, and this is the genius part, it maintains the illusion that you're reading. From a distance, you could plausibly be engrossed in an article about trade policy or cricket scores. Only when you approach and hear the gentle snoring do you realize the truth. There's something deeply endearing about the fact that these powerful men feel the need to pretend they're reading while napping. They can't just close their eyes and sleep like normal humans. They need the newspaper disguise, the plausible deniability. It's as if sleeping is acceptable only if you were theoretically engaged in intellectual activity when sleep overtook you. I wasn't napping, dear fellow. I was reading about the economy and momentarily lost consciousness due to the weight of complex financial concepts. The club most famous for its sleeping culture is Brooks's, where the library is renowned throughout London for having, as one member described it, the most comfortable pillows for afternoon naps in all of England. This isn't hyperbole. Members genuinely discuss the pillow quality the way other people discuss wine vintages. The burgundy velvet cushions near the window are superior for shorter naps, one guide suggests, while the deeper leather chairs in the alcove provide better neck support for extended sleep. Anthony Lejeune, a club historian and member of multiple establishments, once remarked, "You need to belong to at least 3 clubs. You need the beefsteak to go to for lunch, Pratt's to go to for dinner, and somewhere to sleep in the afternoon. Brooks's has lovely bed pillows in the library." Think about that statement. This man categorized his club memberships by meal and sleep schedule, as if London were one large apartment divided into specialized rooms. Breakfast at home, lunch at Beefsteak, nap at Brooks's, dinner at Pratt's. It's like being a toddler with a very expensive routine. But the sleeping arrangements go far beyond afternoon naps in the library. Many clubs have actual bedrooms available for members who need overnight accommodation. White's has several small suites upstairs. The Reform Club has proper guest rooms. These weren't originally intended for out-of-town members visiting London. They were for members avoiding their homes, their wives specifically. If you'd had a particularly heated argument, or if your wife was hosting a social event you found tedious, or if you simply couldn't bear another evening of domestic responsibility, you could book a room at your club and live there for days or even weeks. Some members essentially resided at their clubs. They'd use the club's address for official correspondence. They'd take all their meals there. They'd sleep in the club's rooms and only return home when absolutely necessary. The clubs became surrogate homes for men who found actual homes too demanding. One Victorian memoir describes a member who spent so much time at his club that his children barely recognized him. When asked why he avoided home, he reportedly said, "At the club, nobody asks me to fix anything or make decisions about curtains." The overnight rooms created interesting situations because they existed in a strange limbo between public and private space. The clubs had rules about appropriate behavior in communal areas, no loud conversation, no business discussions, no improper conduct. But in your rented room, that was technically private. This led to situations where members would engage in behavior the club officially frowned upon: excessive drinking, gambling marathon, romantic indiscretions, within the club's walls but behind closed doors. The clubs developed a don't ask, don't tell policy. As long as you were discreet and didn't disturb others, what happened in your room stayed in your room. Now let's talk about the sacred rule of silence, because it's enforced with religious fervour in club libraries and reading rooms. Imagine walking into a room where 8 or 10 men are scattered about in chairs, half of them genuinely reading, half asleep under newspapers. You need to ask someone a question, but speaking above a whisper is strictly forbidden, so you have a choice. You can whisper your question, which risks waking the sleepers, or you can resort to elaborate hand gestures and facial expressions, hoping the person you're trying to communicate with understands pantomime. One member of the Athenaeum reported an incident where a friend had fallen asleep in the reading room with his newspaper tent pitched. Another member, not realizing his friend was asleep, sat down across from him and began quietly reading. After 30 minutes, the sleeping man's newspaper tent collapsed, revealing his unconscious state. The reading member, too polite to disturb him, simply folded his own paper and tiptoed away. The sleeping man woke 2 hours later, having lost an entire afternoon, and nobody had disturbed him. The silence rule was that powerful. There's actually a scene in the film Top Hat from 1935 where Fred Astaire's character gets annoyed with the oppressive silence at a gentleman's club and performs a brief loud tap dance just to irritate the members before leaving. It's played for laughs, but it accurately captures the almost aggressive quietness of these spaces. The silence isn't just about being polite. It's about creating an atmosphere so still, so divorced from the noise of the outside world, that you can almost forget you're in London at all. Some clubs designated specific rooms as storing chambers, though they'd never use such an indelicate term officially. These were smaller rooms, slightly removed from main areas, where members known for loud sleeping could nap without disturbing others. Being directed to use one of these rooms was a gentle form of social feedback. "We enjoy your company, Gerald, but your nasal passages sound like a steam engine, so perhaps you could sleep in the green room instead of the main library." The author P.G. Wodehouse captured this culture perfectly in his fictional Drones Club, where his characters, mostly idle young aristocrats, spend their days eating, drinking, and sleeping in elaborate comfort. In one story, a member tries to sneak past a sleeping friend but trips over a footstool, causing a tremendous crash. The sleeping member doesn't wake up. 2 other members witness this and nod approvingly. "Good sleeper, that one. Takes after his grandfather. Could sleep through a cavalry charge." But here's where the sleeping culture reveals something deeper about what these clubs really offered: escape from expectation. Think about the lives these men led in the Victorian and Edwardian eras. They were expected to manage estates, make important decisions, maintain family honour, participate in politics or business. The pressure was constant. At home, servants needed instructions, wives needed attention, children required discipline. There was no off switch, no moment when you could just stop being responsible, except at the club. At the club, you could literally fall asleep in a public room and nobody would judge you. In fact, they'd protect your rest. They'd maintain the silence. They'd walk softly past you. They'd let you sleep through dinner if that's what you needed. The clubs offered something radical for that time: permission to be unproductive, permission to just exist without contributing, without improving, without doing anything at all. Terry Pratchett captured this beautifully in his novel Thief of Time, where he describes a fictional club called Fidgets. It's a refuge for gentlemen who have spent their lives being ordered around by mothers, nurses, governesses, and wives, where they can sit back, eat unhealthy food, and take naps under tinted newspapers. One of the rules at Fidgets is that women are only allowed inside during a small specified time frame, so any woman seen outside those hours must be a hallucination, and is therefore ignored. It's satire, obviously, but satire that cuts close to truth. The sleeping culture also created interesting dynamics around time. At these clubs, time moved differently. 3 in the afternoon wasn't mid-work day, it was nap time. Evening didn't mean returning home to family, it meant settling in for dinner and cards until midnight or later. Members developed completely different circadian rhythms from normal society. They'd stay up until 2 in the morning gambling, sleep until noon, wake for lunch, nap from 3 to 5, then start the evening cycle again. It was like they existed in a different time zone, one that ran parallel to London, but never quite synced up with it. This separation from normal time had practical consequences. Members would miss family events because they'd fallen asleep at the club and woken up too late. They'd forget appointments because club time didn't recognize external schedules. Some clubs experimented with installing clocks, but members complained that the clocks made them anxious. The absence of timekeeping devices wasn't an oversight, it was intentional design. The clubs wanted to create temporal bubbles where the outside world's demands couldn't penetrate. There are documented cases of members who fell asleep in clubs for truly remarkable lengths of time. One story, possibly apocryphal but widely believed, tells of a member of the Carlton Club who fell asleep in a quiet corner on a Thursday afternoon and wasn't discovered until Saturday morning. Nobody had disturbed him because the corner was rarely used. When he woke, disoriented and stiff, he asked what time dinner was served. The porter gently informed him that he had missed approximately 4 dinner services. The overnight rooms also served a darker purpose that was worth acknowledging. Some members would retreat to their club rooms when dealing with depression, alcoholism, or other personal crises. The clubs provided a space to hide from problems that couldn't be solved. This wasn't healthy, obviously, but it reveals why these institutions were so valued. They were pressure release valves for men who had no other outlet for their struggles. Mental health wasn't discussed openly. Therapy didn't exist in any modern sense. So men would book a room at their club, drink themselves into oblivion, sleep it off, and emerge days later to pretend everything was fine. The sleeping arrangements also highlighted class differences in ways that might not be immediately obvious. If you could afford to maintain club membership, you could afford not to work regular hours. The ability to nap at 3 in the afternoon signaled that you weren't bound by a boss's schedule or business hours. Sleeping at the club was, in a strange way, a flex. It said, "I'm so financially secure that I can waste entire afternoons unconscious in a leather chair and nobody can tell me otherwise." Let me tell you about one particular tradition that still exists at some clubs, the wake-up service. If you're sleeping overnight in a club room and have an early commitment, a train to catch, a meeting to attend, you can request that a porter wake you at a specific time. But here's the delightful part. The porter will knock gently on your door, wait for acknowledgement, and if you don't respond, they'll simply leave. They won't knock louder, won't enter the room, won't ensure you're actually awake. The assumption is that a gentleman is responsible for waking himself, and the porter's role is merely to provide a courtesy reminder. This contrasts sharply with modern hotel wake-up calls, where staff will call repeatedly until you answer. At the clubs, your failure to wake up is your problem. They've fulfilled their duty by knocking once. What you do with that information is your business. It's autonomy taken to an almost absurd extreme. We'll help you, but we won't save you from yourself. The library sleeping culture has survived into the 21st century with surprisingly little modification. Visit Brooks's today, and you'll still find members asleep under newspapers. The chairs have been reupholstered, the newspapers are different publications, but the essential ritual remains unchanged. In an age of smartphones and constant connectivity, there's something almost revolutionary about men putting newspapers over their faces and checking out for 2 hours in the middle of the day. But here's what I find most touching about the sleeping traditions. They're fundamentally about trust. When you fall asleep in a public room, you're vulnerable. You're snoring, possibly drooling, definitely not at your most dignified. And yet club members trust that nobody will mock them, photograph them, or disturb them. That trust, that unspoken agreement that we'll protect each other's rest, is perhaps the most genuine form of community these clubs created. Everything else might be about exclusion and competition, but the sleeping culture is about mutual care, however oddly expressed. As you think about drifting off to sleep yourself tonight, there's something almost comforting about knowing that somewhere in London, gentlemen are sleeping in libraries under newspapers, being guarded by silence and tradition. They're participating in a ritual that stretches back centuries, finding rest in rooms specifically designed for it. It's absurd, yes, but it's also kind of beautiful. The world outside might be chaotic and demanding, but inside those walls, for a few hours at least, you can sleep in peace. And speaking of what happens inside those walls, the sleeping wasn't the only peculiar tradition around comfort and food. Because while we've talked about where these gentlemen slept, we haven't yet discussed what they ate when they woke up. And trust me, the dining customs at these clubs, specifically the obsession with what they called nursery food, opens up a whole new dimension of delightful strangeness. You're a 65-year-old member of parliament. You control significant wealth, make decisions affecting millions of people, and command respect wherever you go. Tonight, you've come to Buck's Club for dinner, ready to enjoy the finest cuisine London has to offer. The waiter, properly attired, impeccably polite, presents you with the menu. And there, printed in elegant script, are your options. Roast beef with Yorkshire pudding, bangers and mash, spotted dick, treacle tart and bread and butter pudding. You're not in a children's cafeteria. You're in one of London's most exclusive establishments, and you're about to eat exactly what you ate when you were 7 years old. Captain Peter Murison, the club secretary at Buck's, described the food philosophy perfectly when he called it nursery food. That's not an insult or a joke, that's the actual term they use with pride. Nursery food. The kind of simple, starchy, comforting dishes that nannies fed to upper-class children in the nursery rooms of Victorian and Edwardian estates. And these grown men, these titans of industry and government, actively seek it out. They could eat anywhere in London. Michelin-starred restaurants would welcome them with open arms, but they choose to eat toad in the hole and jam roly-poly at their clubs. Let me give you a sense of what we're talking about here. At the Travellers' Club, one of the dinner staples is roast saddle of hare with port and chestnuts. That sounds sophisticated, right? Almost continental. But it's served alongside boiled potatoes and overcooked vegetables, prepared in a style that hasn't changed since Queen Victoria's reign. The Savile Club features Lancashire hot pot on their regular lunch menu, a peasant dish from northern England, essentially mutton stew with sliced potatoes on top, slow cooked until everything becomes one beige mass. This isn't fusion cuisine or ironic comfort food. This is genuinely what they want to eat. Boodle's has a dessert called Boodle's Orange Fool that's been served since the club's founding in 1762. It's cake soaked in orange juice and topped with cream. That's it. No exotic spices, no molecular gastronomy, just cake, juice, and cream. And members order it reverently as if it's a culinary masterpiece rather than something you'd make with a child on a rainy afternoon. The recipe hasn't changed in over 260 years because, well, why would it? Change suggests the original was inadequate, and we can't have that. Now, you might be wondering, surely some innovative chef has tried to modernize these menus, introduce some flavour, some creativity, some acknowledgement that food culture has evolved since 1850? The answer is yes, they've tried, and they failed spectacularly. Young chefs fresh out of culinary school get hired at these clubs with dreams of introducing their skills. They imagine creating beautiful plates, experimenting with techniques, earning recognition for elevating traditional British cuisine. Then reality hits. They propose adding a reduction sauce to the roast beef. The members complain that it masks the meat's flavour. They suggest a herb-crusted lamb instead of plain boiled mutton. Members ask when the proper lamb will be available. They attempt a deconstructed shepherd's pie with artistic plating. The members literally send it back to the kitchen with a note asking for normal food. After a few months of having every creative impulse crushed, most young chefs either quit or resign themselves to cooking like it's 1920. Captain Murison of Buck's explained this phenomenon with remarkable honesty. Our members like what they like. They don't come here for culinary adventures. They come here for the roast beef and Yorkshire pudding their nannies made them. Any chef who doesn't understand that won't last long. Translation: we're paying you to recreate childhood memories, not to be creative. Your job is time travel, not innovation. But here's the question that keeps me fascinated. Why? These are sophisticated men. They've travelled the world. They have eaten at the finest restaurants in Paris, Rome, New York. They know what good food can be, so why do they voluntarily choose to eat like Victorian school children? The answer, I think, is exactly that. It's voluntary regression. These men spend their days being adults, making hard decisions, dealing with complex problems, managing difficult people. Adult life is exhausting and often unsatisfying, but at their club, eating their nursery food, they can briefly return to a time when life was simpler, when the hardest decision was whether to have seconds of pudding, when comfort was measured in starch and sugar rather than stock portfolios and political manoeuvring. There's also something deeply nostalgic happening here that connects to class and childhood. Upper-class British children were typically raised by nannies, not parents. Your nanny was often the primary source of comfort, affection, and security in your young life. And nannies cooked simple food, hearty, filling, uncomplicated dishes that children would actually eat. So for these men, nursery food isn't just comfort food. It's love food. It's the taste of being cared for, being safe, being young enough that someone else handled all the difficult parts of life. Let me tell you about a specific incident that perfectly captures this dynamic. In the early 2000s, the Reform Club, which actually has a reputation for slightly better food than other clubs, hired a chef who'd trained in French cuisine. He was excited to bring sophisticated techniques to traditional British ingredients. His first week he prepared beef Wellington, hardly revolutionary, still thoroughly British, but executed with proper technique and an elegant red wine reduction. The members hated it, not because it tasted bad, by all accounts it was delicious, but because it wasn't what they expected. It required them to think about what they were eating, to notice flavours and textures, to engage with the food as food, rather than as edible nostalgia. One member reportedly said, "When I come to the club for dinner, I don't want to think. I want to eat what I know, taste what I remember, and not be challenged." The chef quietly returned to simpler preparations. This rejection of culinary innovation reveals something profound about what these clubs really offer. Predictability in an unpredictable world. Everything outside the club walls changes constantly. Politics shift, markets fluctuate, technology advances. But inside the club, the spotted dick tastes exactly like it did in 1950, which tasted exactly like it did in 1850. That continuity is the point. The lack of change is the appeal. There's also a bizarre class signalling happening with this food. In modern Britain, people who can afford to eat diverse international cuisine. They seek out Thai, Indian, Japanese restaurants. They experiment with flavours and techniques from around the world. Eating only traditional British food, particularly nursery food, is something people do when they can't afford alternatives. Except at these clubs it's the opposite. Choosing nursery food becomes a way of signalling that you're so securely upper class that you don't need to prove your sophistication through cosmopolitan eating habits. It's like reverse food snobbery. The nouveau riche eat at Michelin-starred restaurants and post about it on Instagram. Old money eats toad in the hole at their club and doesn't mention it to anyone. The simplicity becomes the status symbol. We're so confident in our position that we can eat like peasants and nobody questions our class credentials. Pratt's Club takes this to an extreme with their historical sourcing. For years they borrowed their cooks from the barracks of the Queen's Guard. Military cooks trained to feed soldiers, preparing food for aristocrats. The reasoning? Military cooks know how to make simple, hearty food in large quantities without fuss. They don't get creative. They follow recipes exactly. They produce consistency, not innovation. For Pratt's, this was ideal. They wanted institutional food with reliable outcomes, and military kitchens were already optimized for exactly that. The beverage choices at these clubs mirror the food conservatism. Port is ubiquitous, thick, sweet, fortified wine that was fashionable in the 18th century and remains frozen in time at the clubs. Brandy, whiskey, and gin are the standard spirits. You can probably get wine if you ask, but many clubs have wine lists that haven't been updated in decades. One member joked that his club's house white was so old it had become vintage by accident. Coffee is available, of course, but it's typically prepared the way it was in Victorian times. Strong, black, and unremarkable. The modern coffee revolution, espressos, cappuccinos, pour-overs, single-origin beans, has largely bypassed these institutions. You won't find a latte at White's. The very concept of ordering a flat white with oat milk would probably cause the staff to politely suggest you visit a coffee shop instead. But let's talk about the specific dishes that dominate these menus, because each one tells a story about British food culture and childhood. Spotted Dick, and yes, that's genuinely what it's called, is a steamed suet pudding with dried fruit. Suet is hard fat from around animal kidneys. It makes the pudding dense and filling. The spots are the raisins or currants mixed throughout. It's served with custard and eaten hot. Describing it makes it sound terrible. Eating it feels like being wrapped in a warm blanket. That's the appeal. It's not pleasure in a culinary sense. It's comfort in a psychological sense. Treacle tart is another staple. A pastry shell filled with golden syrup, breadcrumbs, and lemon juice. It's intensely sweet, sticky, and completely one-note in flavour. There's no complexity, no layering of tastes. It's sugar and carbs, pure childhood energy food. Adults eating it aren't seeking sophisticated dessert. They're seeking the endorphin hit of childhood treats. Yorkshire pudding deserves special mention because Americans often misunderstand what it is. It's not pudding in the American sense. Not sweet, not creamy. It's a baked batter of eggs, flour and milk, traditionally cooked in the drippings from roasting meat. It puffs up into a crispy, hollow shell that you fill with gravy. Children love it because it's fun to eat. Adults love it because it reminds them of being children. The clubs serve it with almost every roast, and members would riot if it were removed from the menu. Bread and butter pudding is perhaps the ultimate nursery dessert. Literally made from leftover stale bread soaked in egg and milk, mixed with raisins, baked until sere, and served with cream or custard. It's a poverty dish historically, using up bread that would otherwise be thrown away. But at the clubs, it's served as if it's a delicacy. Because for upper-class children, this was the treat their nannies made from leftovers, and the associations are powerful enough to override any objective assessment of the dish. Bangers and mash, sausages with mashed potatoes, might be the most telling dish of all. It's pub food, working class food, the kind of thing you'd eat at a football match or a casual dinner. But at the clubs, it's prepared with ceremony, served on fine china, eaten with silver cutlery. The juxtaposition is almost satirical. Here are men in expensive suits, sitting in rooms decorated with priceless art, eating the same meal a truck driver might grab at a roadside cafe, except they're paying 10 times as much for the privilege. The portions at these clubs are also telling. They're generous, sometimes absurdly so. This isn't modern cuisine with carefully measured portions designed to be satisfying but not overfilling. This is eat until you're uncomfortable food. Nursery portions. Because when you're a child, adults control your food, and sometimes that means being told to finish your plate even when you're full. As an adult at a club, you can finally control your portions, but the psychology remains. More food equals more comfort, more care, more love. There's also a complete absence of dietary accommodation at most traditional clubs. Vegetarian options, maybe a cheese omelette if you ask nicely. Vegan food, don't be ridiculous. Gluten-free, the chef will look at you like you've requested moon rocks. The assumption is that proper British gentlemen eat meat, eat bread, eat dairy, and don't make a fuss about it. Special dietary needs are viewed as weakness, or worse, as fashionable affectation. This is slowly changing. Even the most traditional clubs have had to acknowledge that some members have genuine allergies or medical conditions requiring dietary restrictions. But the changes happen reluctantly, with much grumbling about how complicated everything has become. And, in my day, you simply ate what was served. The ritual around meals at clubs reinforces the nursery atmosphere. At many clubs, lunch and dinner are served at fixed times. You don't order à la carte from a menu with dozens of options. You're presented with 2 or 3 choices, pre-selected by the kitchen. You make your choice, and that's what you get. It's exactly how meals work in institutional settings, schools, hospitals, military bases. You're given options, not infinite choice. And apparently for club members this is comforting rather than restrictive. Some clubs even have assigned seating at certain meals. You sit where you're told, potentially next to people you don't know well. It's communal dining nursery style, where the adults decide the social arrangements and the children, members, accommodate themselves to the structure. The loss of control is the appeal. You don't have to make decisions about where to sit or whom to talk to. It's been decided for you, just like when you were young. What absolutely fascinates me about all this is how it contradicts the image these clubs project of sophisticated worldly gentlemen. If you based your understanding solely on the dress codes and formal etiquette we discussed earlier, you'd imagine these men eating refined continental cuisine, discussing wine vintages, demonstrating impeccable taste in all things. But then you discover they're eating shepherd's pie and rice pudding, and suddenly the whole facade cracks a bit. They're not sophisticated cosmopolitans. They're homesick children in expensive suits. And maybe that's the most honest thing about the clubs. Strip away the pretension, the exclusivity, the elaborate rituals, and what do you have? Men who want to feel safe and cared for. Men who associate safety and care with the food of their childhood. Men who would rather eat familiar comfort food than impressive cuisine, because impressive requires effort and they're tired of making effort. As you think about your own comfort foods tonight, consider what they reveal about you. What tastes take you back to feeling safe? What foods represent love and care in your personal history? The gentlemen at their clubs eating spotted dick aren't so different from the rest of us seeking mac and cheese or chicken soup when we're stressed. We all want to be children again sometimes, if only for the duration of a meal. But if you think the food is the strangest part of club dining, wait until you hear about the bow window at White's Club. Because while most members were eating their nursery food in relative anonymity, a select few sat in one specific window seat that functioned as a throne, a judge's bench, and a public performance stage all at once. And from that window, they quite literally controlled London fashion and society with nothing more than their facial expressions. There's a particular window at White's Club, a curved bay window jutting out onto St. James's Street, that wielded more power over British society than most government offices, not because of anything that happened inside the building, but because of who sat in front of that window and what they did while sitting there. From this single architectural feature, a handful of men controlled fashion, reputation, and social acceptance across London. Their weapon wasn't money or political office. It was something far more devastating, their facial expressions. The bow window was installed when White's moved to its current location at 37 to 38 St. James's Street in 1778. It's positioned on the ground floor, creating a perfect viewing platform for the street outside. Architecturally, it's elegant but not ostentatious, a gentle curve of glass that catches the afternoon light beautifully. But what made this window famous wasn't its design. It was the table placed directly in front of it, and the understanding that whoever sat at that table held a position of almost absurd social power. The first true master of the bow window was George Bryan Brummell, known to history as Beau Brummell. If you don't know his story, let me tell you, because it's one of the most fascinating rise and fall tales in British history. Brummel wasn't born into the highest aristocracy. His grandfather had been a valet, a personal servant. His father worked his way up to become private secretary to the Prime Minister, which provided enough money to send young George to Eton and Oxford. But Brummel had no title, no vast estates, no hereditary wealth to fall back on. What he had was taste, impeccable, innovative, revolutionary taste in men's fashion. And from the bow window at White's, he turned that taste into total social dominance. Here's how it worked. Brummel and a few select friends, the arbiters of fashion and style, would sit at the bow window table in the late morning and early afternoon. St. James's Street was the heart of fashionable London, the place where anyone who was anyone would walk, and as people passed by, Brummel and his companions would judge them. Not privately, not discreetly, publicly and devastatingly. If a gentleman walked by wearing an outfit Brummel approved of, he might receive a slight nod. That nod was social gold. It meant you were acceptable, fashionable, worthy of notice. But if Brummel disapproved, he might simply turn away, conversation continuing as if you didn't exist. Or worse, he might make a comment, loud enough for his companions to hear, quiet enough that you couldn't quite catch the words, and his friends would laugh. You'd walk away knowing you'd been judged and found wanting, but never knowing exactly what the offence was. The psychological warfare of this system is extraordinary. Imagine you're a young gentleman trying to establish yourself in London society. You've spent hours getting dressed, consulting with your tailor, making sure every detail is perfect. You step out onto St. James's Street, and as you approach White's, you see Brummel in the window. Your heart rate increases. You try to walk naturally, not too fast, not too slow, not looking at the window, but knowing he's looking at you. And then you're past, and you didn't get a nod. What does that mean? Rejection? Or simply that he didn't notice you? The uncertainty eats at you for days. Brummel's power came from his friendship with the Prince of Wales, who later became King George IV. The prince, despite being heir to the throne, looked up to Brummel as the ultimate authority on style and social behaviour. If Brummel approved of you, you had access to the prince's circle, which meant access to power and influence. If Brummel rejected you, even royal favour couldn't fully restore your reputation. It was an inversion of the normal social hierarchy, a man with no title controlling the man who would be king, at least in the realm of fashion. But Brummel's genius wasn't just in having taste, it was in understanding that taste is only powerful when it's exclusive. He didn't write fashion guides or give interviews, he didn't explain his choices or justify his judgments. He simply sat in the bow window, exuding authority, and let London come to him for approval. The less he explained, the more powerful he became. Mystery breeds authority. The specific fashions Brummel championed seem almost boring by modern standards. He preferred dark, well-cut coats over the colourful, elaborate outfits that had been fashionable in the 18th century. He insisted on perfect tailoring, clothes that fit so well they looked effortless. He introduced the concept of the modern necktie, spending hours arranging his cravat until it achieved the perfect casual elegance. His revolutionary insight was that true sophistication looks simple, while trying too hard looks desperate. From the bow window he enforced these standards ruthlessly. If someone wore a cravat tied in an outdated style, Brummel might spend 5 minutes loudly discussing the proper way to tie a cravat, never mentioning the offender by name but making it clear who inspired the lesson. If someone's coat didn't fit properly, Brummel might remark to his companions about how unfortunate it is when gentlemen don't understand the importance of a good tailor. The passive aggression was an art form. One famous story, possibly embellished but widely believed, tells of a gentleman who passed the bow window wearing a waistcoat Brummel found garish. Brummel called out to him, "My dear fellow, do you call that thing a waistcoat?" The man, embarrassed, tried to defend his choice. Brummel simply turned to his companions and said, "He actually believes that's a waistcoat. How extraordinary." The man reportedly never wore bright colours again. But the bow window wasn't just about fashion. It was about power dynamics and social control. Think about what Brummel created. A system where simply walking down a public street became an act of submission to judgment, where your clothing choices could make or break your social standing, where a man with no official authority could destroy reputations with a raised eyebrow. It's social media, before social media existed, public judgment, viral humiliation, the power of influential tastemakers to create or destroy social capital. The comparison to modern influencers is almost too perfect. Brummel was essentially an Instagram fashion critic, except instead of posting stories, he sat in a window. Instead of likes and comments, he gave nods and smirks. The mechanism changed, but the dynamics are identical. Someone with cultural capital judging those seeking approval, with the judgment itself becoming part of the entertainment. Brummel's reign from the bow window lasted about 15 years, from roughly 1800 to 1816. During that time, he was arguably the most influential tastemaker in England. But his fall was as dramatic as his rise. He gambled heavily. Remember all those stories about the betting book, and accumulated massive debts. He also made the catastrophic mistake of insulting the Prince of Wales, who had grown tired of being treated as Brummel's student rather than his patron. In 1816, with creditors closing in and his royal friendship destroyed, Brummel fled to France to escape debtors' prison. He spent the last 24 years of his life in exile, eventually dying in poverty and madness in a French asylum in 1840. The man who'd controlled London fashion from a window ended his life alone, broke and forgotten. It's a sobering reminder that influence built on something as fragile as taste can evaporate overnight. But the bow window throne outlived Brummel. When he fled, William Arden, the second Baron Alvanley, took his place. Remember Alvanley? He's the one who bet £3,000 on raindrops racing down the window. Alvanley maintained the tradition of judging passers-by, though by all accounts he was less cutting than Brummel. Where Brummel destroyed with mockery, Alvanley merely observed and commented. The terror was still there. Nobody wanted to be discussed unfavourably by Alvanley and his companions, but it lacked Brummel's cruel precision. After Alvanley, the bow window seat was reserved for Arthur Wellesley, the first Duke of Wellington, the man who defeated Napoleon at Waterloo. Think about that for a moment. One of Britain's greatest military heroes, a man who shaped European history, spent his retirement sitting in a window judging people's outfits. What does that tell you about what British society valued? Military genius was impressive, but fashion authority was eternal. Wellington held the bow window throne until his death in 1852. Unlike Brummel and Alvanley, Wellington didn't engage in public mockery. He simply sat there, a living monument, and his presence was judgment enough. If the Duke of Wellington looked at you from that window, you felt the weight of his gaze regardless of whether he approved or disapproved. The man had stared down French cavalry charges. Your cravat wasn't going to impress him either way. What's remarkable is how this tradition, which could have been seen as cruel or petty, was instead celebrated as sophisticated cultural commentary. Satirists drew cartoons of the bow window judges, writers referenced it in novels. The general public seemed to accept that certain men had earned the right to publicly judge their social inferiors, and that this judgment was somehow beneficial to society. It kept standards high, the reasoning went. It prevented the decline into casual slovenliness. But let's be honest about what it really was. Bullying formalized into tradition. These men used their position, literally their physical position in a window, to make others feel small. They took pleasure in their power to affect how people felt about themselves. And they did it all under the guise of maintaining standards and promoting good taste. It's every mean girl clique from every high school, except these were grown men in their 40s and 50s doing it to other grown men. The psychology of seeking approval from the bow window reveals something uncomfortable about human nature. These men being judged weren't powerless. Many were wealthy, titled, successful in their own right, but they still craved the nod from the window. They still felt diminished by its absence. Why? Because humans are social creatures desperate for acceptance from whoever we've decided represents the in-group. Brummel and his successors understood this and exploited it brilliantly. There's also something deeply sad about the bow window tradition when you think about it from the judge's perspective. These men spent their afternoon sitting in a window watching people walk by, finding fault with strangers' clothing. What kind of life is that? How empty must your days be that this constitutes entertainment? Brummel, at least, was building a career. His fashion influence was real power that translated into social access and opportunity. But Alvanley and Wellington? They were already established. They didn't need the bow window for career advancement. They sat there because they had nothing better to do. The tradition gradually faded after Wellington's death. The bow window remained. It's still there today, but it stopped being the throne of social judgment. Fashion became more democratic. Magazines and newspapers started publishing style guides. The idea that a few men in a window could control what everyone wore became increasingly absurd as the 19th century progressed. By the Edwardian era, the bow window was just a nice place to sit and watch the street stripped of its former power. But while it lasted, the bow window represented something uniquely British. The belief that elaborate social hierarchies and public humiliation could be disguised as refinement and good taste. That cruelty could be sophisticated if executed with proper style. That judging others wasn't mean-spiritedness. It was civic duty, keeping standards high for the betterment of all. Today, if you walk past White's and look at that bow window, you'll usually see it empty or occupied by members reading newspapers, having conversations, completely unaware of the street outside. The window has lost its power because we've realized mostly that giving a small group of self-appointed arbiters the power to publicly judge everyone else isn't actually a good system. It's just bullying with better architecture. But has it really disappeared? Or have we just moved it online? The bow window judges have become Twitter reply guys, Instagram critics, Reddit comment sections. The mechanism is digital instead of physical, but the impulse is identical. Publicly judge others, claim you're maintaining standards, feel powerful through criticism. Brummel would have been an absolutely devastating social media influencer. He had the skills, the cutting remarks, the cultivated mystique, the understanding that influence comes from exclusion rather than inclusion. As you think about drifting off tonight, consider how much mental energy you've spent seeking approval from people who probably don't deserve the power you've given them. The bow window exists in all our lives in different forms. The boss whose opinion matters too much, the friend group whose acceptance we crave, the social media metrics we check obsessively. We've all walked past our own version of that window, hoping for a nod we probably don't need. But here's something that might make you smile. For all the power those men had from their window perch, they were still just sitting in a club, watching life pass by outside. The people walking past were actually doing things, going places, living their lives. The judges were static, trapped by their own need to judge. In the end, who really had more power? The person being judged, or the person whose entire identity depended on having others seek their approval? And speaking of approval and social control, if you thought the bow window was the peak of exclusivity, you haven't heard the full story about who was allowed into these clubs in the first place. Because while men were busy judging each other's fashion from windows, there was an entire gender that couldn't even enter the building. The women problem, and the truly bizarre ways these clubs handled it, opens up yet another dimension of absurdity. It's 1991, and something unprecedented is about to happen at White's Club. Queen Elizabeth II, the reigning monarch of the United Kingdom, Supreme Governor of the Church of England, head of the Commonwealth, is coming to visit. This should be straightforward. She's the Queen. White's is on her territory. But there's a problem. White's has never allowed a woman inside its doors, not once in 298 years. And now the club faces an impossible choice. Maintain their male-only tradition or permit the literal Queen of England to enter. After intense debate, White's makes an exception. One exception, in 3 centuries, for the Queen, and only the Queen. Think about the absurdity of that for a moment. These men, many of whom work in government and swear oaths of loyalty to the crown, nonetheless required serious deliberation before deciding whether their monarch could visit. The tradition of excluding women was so sacred, so fundamental to the club's identity, that even royal authority couldn't automatically override it. The Queen was gracious about it, of course. She understood the ridiculousness of the situation better than anyone. But the fact that it was even a discussion tells you everything about how deeply these clubs feared female presence. And I use the word feared intentionally, because that's what it was. Not just preference or tradition, actual fear. These men created elaborate justifications for why women couldn't be members or even guests. They claimed women would change the atmosphere, make men unable to relax, introduce domestic concerns into their sanctuary. But underneath all those rationalizations was a simpler truth. These men were terrified of having to behave properly. Women's presence meant they couldn't burp, swear, gamble excessively, drink themselves silly, or sleep under newspapers in peace. Women meant accountability, and accountability was exactly what they'd built these clubs to escape. Let me tell you about the East India Club, because their approach to the women problem was particularly revealing. The East India Club was founded in the mid-19th century for officers of the East India Company, men who'd spent years in colonial India, making fortunes while maintaining British superiority in foreign lands. When they returned to London, they wanted a club that felt familiar, that maintained the hierarchies they'd enjoyed abroad. This included keeping women firmly in their place. The East India Club eventually, grudgingly, allowed women to visit, but with conditions so specific they border on parody. Women could only enter during certain hours. They had to use the back entrance. They were restricted to specific rooms and forbidden from others. And perhaps most telling, they had to be accompanied by a male member at all times, as if they might spontaneously combust or steal the silverware if left unsupervised. The message was clear. Women were tolerated, barely, but never welcomed. When the club's treasurer embezzled £500,000 in the early 2000s, the club's first concern wasn't recovering the money or prosecuting the crime, it was maintaining discretion. They didn't want publicity, they didn't want scandal, because scandal might attract attention to how they operated, and attention might lead to demands for modernization, and modernization might mean admitting women as equal members. Better to quietly absorb £500,000 in losses than risk the male sanctuary being invaded. But the award for most creative approach to excluding women has to go to Pratt's Club, which maintained its male-only membership for 166 years, until 2023. 166 years. Let that sink in. Pratt's was founded in 1857. It admitted its first female members in 2023. This means that for the entire span of women's suffrage, World War I, World War II, the Civil Rights Movement, the Sexual Revolution, the Feminist Movement, the Internet Age, and global social media, Pratt's remained steadfastly, stubbornly male-only, and even when they finally reluctantly voted to admit women, under significant pressure from the Duke of Devonshire, who owns the property, the change was essentially symbolic. They've admitted 2 or 3 women out of 600 members. The ratio is so skewed that calling Pratt's now open to women is technically accurate and practically meaningless. It's like a country club with 1,000 members admitting 2 people of colour and declaring itself integrated. The justifications these clubs offered for excluding women evolved over time, each more absurd than the last. In the 19th century, they claimed women were too delicate for the rough masculine environment of club life. The smoking, the drinking, the coarse conversation, it would offend feminine sensibilities. By the mid-20th century, when that excuse had worn thin, they shifted to arguing that men needed spaces away from women to be fully themselves. It wasn't about protecting women, it was about protecting men's right to relax. By the late 20th century, facing actual legal and social pressure, the justifications became even more convoluted. They argued that private clubs should be allowed to set their own membership criteria, that forcing them to admit women violated their freedom of association. This is technically true. Private organisations generally can set their own rules, but the argument conveniently ignored that these weren't just social clubs. They were where business deals happened, where political alliances formed, where professional networks developed. Excluding women from clubs meant excluding them from power. David Cameron, who served as British Prime Minister from 2010 to 2016, was a member of White's for 15 years before resigning his membership in 2008. Why did he resign? Because White's refused to admit women, and Cameron, by then a rising political figure, couldn't justify belonging to an explicitly sexist institution while claiming to support gender equality. His father had been chairman of White's, so leaving wasn't easy. But even he, with all his privilege and connections, recognised that male-only clubs in the 21st century were indefensible. The fact that White's didn't care about losing a future Prime Minister's membership tells you how seriously they take their traditions. They'd rather be exclusive and controversial than inclusive and modern. And honestly, from their perspective, that's probably the right business decision. The controversy makes them more desirable to the men who do get admitted. Nothing increases demand like exclusivity, even when that exclusivity is based on outdated prejudice. Now let's talk about the Reform Club, which deserves recognition for being the first major London gentlemen's club to admit women as equal members. This happened in 1981, not exactly early, but decades ahead of most other clubs. The Reform Club was founded in 1836 for supporters of the Great Reform Act, which had expanded voting rights in Britain. The irony of a club celebrating democratic reform excluding half the population apparently took 145 years to become obvious. When the Reform Club finally voted to admit women, it wasn't unanimous. The debate was heated, with older members arguing that centuries of tradition would be destroyed, that the essential character of the club would change forever. But younger members pointed out that excluding women was becoming socially untenable. Universities had gone coeducational, workplaces had integrated. The clubs were increasingly seen as dinosaurs, embarrassing relics of a bygone era. The vote to admit women passed, though not overwhelmingly. And you know what happened? The club didn't collapse. Men didn't flee in horror. The leather chairs remained comfortable. The food continued to be mediocre. Life went on, except now women could also enjoy mediocre food in comfortable chairs. The apocalypse that older members predicted never materialized, which makes you wonder what they were really afraid of all along. The Athenaeum followed in 2002, 178 years after its founding. The Garrick Club, famous for theatrical and literary members, held out until 2015. Each time a club admitted women, the same pattern played out. Dire predictions from traditionalists, actual vote narrowly passing, new female members joining, and then nothing dramatic happening. The clubs continued operating much as they always had, just with a slightly more diverse membership. But 8 clubs in London remain steadfastly male-only. As of 2025, Whites, Brookses, Boodles, Bucks, Pratts, technically open but effectively male-only, the Travellers Club, the Beefsteak Club, and the East India Club. These holdouts represent the last bastions of institutional gender exclusion in British society. They're allowed to maintain these policies because they're private clubs, not public accommodations. But their continued existence raises uncomfortable questions about whether private discrimination is acceptable when those private spaces are where public power concentrates. The women-only clubs that exist, like the University Women's Club founded in 1921, or the Albright founded in 2018, are often pointed to by male-only clubs as proof that gender-exclusive spaces are fair for both sexes. But this is a false equivalence. Women's clubs weren't created to exclude men from power. They were created because women were excluded from everywhere else. They're a response to discrimination, not a parallel form of it. There's a brilliant moment in Terry Pratchett's novel Thief of Time where he describes the fictional Fidgets Club and its approach to women. The club only allows women inside during a small specified time frame. Any woman seen outside those hours must therefore be a hallucination caused by stress or excessive pork consumption and is consequently ignored. It's satire, obviously, but it's also barely more absurd than the real policies these clubs maintained. The psychological gymnastics required to exclude women from clubs while claiming not to be sexist are genuinely impressive. Members would argue, it's not that we think women are inferior, we just need a space without them. As if needing to be away from an entire gender isn't itself a statement about how you view that gender. They'd say, women have their own clubs, so it's equal. As if pretending women's clubs have equivalent power and influence makes it true. Some members offered even stranger justifications. Men and women socialise differently. Men need to be around other men to bond properly. This would be more convincing if these same men didn't spend their workdays with women colleagues, their home lives with women family members, and their social lives with women friends. The only time they needed to be away from women was at their clubs, which suggests the issue wasn't about different socialization styles. It was about preserving a space where outdated masculine behavior wouldn't be challenged. Here's a question worth considering. What exactly were these men doing at their clubs that required women's absence? We've talked about gambling, drinking, sleeping, and eating nursery food. None of these activities are inherently male. Women gamble, drink, sleep, and eat comfort food too. So what was it really about? I think it comes down to something simpler and sadder. These men wanted a place where they could be adolescents without judgment, where they could be irresponsible, petty, and silly without having to be the grown-ups they pretended to be everywhere else. And women represented adulthood, responsibility, consequences. The irony is that by excluding women, the clubs created environments where men never had to grow up, where at 60 years old you could still act like you're 20 because everyone around you was acting the same way. It's Peter Pan syndrome institutionalized, and while that might sound fun, it's also kind of tragic. These powerful men running countries and corporations clinging to adolescent freedoms because adult responsibilities feel too heavy. The clubs that have admitted women report almost universally that it hasn't changed much. Women join, pay their dues, use the facilities, and generally fit in just fine. They don't demand curtains be changed or carpets replaced. They don't impose domestic concerns on club life. They just exist as members, same as the men. which reveals that all the fears about women destroying club culture were always nonsense. The real fear was that women would demand the men act like mature adults, and that turned out to be largely unfounded. Women who join these clubs understand what they're joining. But here's what's genuinely changed. The clubs that remain male-only are increasingly seen as peculiar anachronisms. Young, wealthy men, the next generation who would normally join, are less interested because belonging to a male-only institution is now a liability rather than an asset. The clubs face a choice: evolve or die. Some are choosing evolution, others are choosing die slowly while maintaining principles. Time will tell which strategy works. As you think about falling asleep tonight, consider the energy these men devoted to keeping women out. The committees formed, the votes taken, the arguments made, the traditions defended. All that effort, all that anxiety, all that fear over what? Over sharing a dining room, over allowing women to sit in their leather chairs. The magnitude of the reaction suggests the threat wasn't really about logistics or atmosphere. It was about identity. These men built their sense of self around being part of an exclusive male group. Admitting women didn't just change the club, it changed what membership meant. And perhaps that's why the holdouts are so stubborn. They're not really defending male-only space. They're defending their understanding of who they are. When your identity is wrapped up in belonging to something exclusive, making it less exclusive feels like losing yourself, even when what you're losing is just the right to eat spotted dick without women present. But if you think the women problem is the height of club absurdity, we haven't yet discussed the rules. Not the big rules about membership and dress codes, we've covered those. I'm talking about the small, bizarre, incredibly specific rules that govern daily life at these clubs. Rules so arbitrary, so unnecessary, so perfectly crafted to make life difficult for no good reason, that they make everything else we've discussed seem almost sensible by comparison. Here's a rule that actually exists at traditional gentlemen's clubs, written down in their official guidelines. No discussion of trade or business shall take place within club premises. Let that sink in for a moment. These are clubs whose membership consists primarily of businessmen, politicians and landowners, people whose entire lives revolve around commerce and deal-making, and they've created sanctuaries where the very topic that connects them all is officially forbidden. Of course, business deals happen at these clubs constantly. Fortunes change hands over brandy, political alliances form over dinner. But officially, no business discussion allowed. The hypocrisy is so perfect it's almost artistic. This contradiction between stated rules and actual behaviour runs through every aspect of club life like a thread of pure absurdity. The clubs have spent centuries creating elaborate regulations that everyone understands are meant to be selectively ignored. It's a system where following the rules makes you naive, and knowing which rules can be broken makes you sophisticated. Welcome to the gentleman's club approach to governance, where everything is forbidden and nothing is enforced, unless someone important decides otherwise. Let me start with the rule about not bringing strangers into the club, because Pratt's enforces this one with almost comical severity. Their rulebook states, "No member shall bring a stranger into the club under any pretense whatsoever." The language is absolute. No stranger, no pretense, no exceptions. In practice, this means even close friends who aren't members can't visit. Your brother? No. Your business partner? Definitely not. Your son if he's not yet a member himself? Sorry, he's a stranger under club rules. The only people you can bring are other club members, which makes the word bring somewhat redundant. The practical effect of this rule is that Pratt's operates like a sealed terrarium of the same 600 men encountering each other in different combinations night after night. No fresh perspectives, no new faces, just the same conversations with slight variations, repeating forever. It's less a social club and more a long-running theatrical production where the cast never changes, but the script gets slightly more worn each performance. But here's my favourite absurd rule, and this one appears in multiple clubs with minor variations. Members are instructed not to lend money to other members. The exact wording from an old etiquette guide reads, "Should you be appealed to by a member for monetary assistance, have courage and refuse. These people are excellent readers of character and hunt their prey with skill and persistence till their nefarious work meets its reward and the club is cleansed of their presence." Think about the worldview embedded in that statement. The assumption is that any member asking to borrow money is a predator hunting prey, not a friend in temporary difficulty, not a gentleman fallen on hard times, a predator. And the recommended response isn't sympathy or assistance, it's refusal so the club can be cleansed of the contaminated member. The cruelty is breathtaking, made worse by being presented as proper etiquette. Don't help your fellow members, expose them to ruin so they can be removed. This rule reveals the darker truth about these clubs. They're built on competition as much as camaraderie. Yes, you're all members of the same exclusive group, but you're also constantly evaluating each other, looking for signs of weakness, ready to distance yourself from anyone who might drag down your own status. The clubs foster a peculiar form of friendship, intimate yet ruthless, based on shared privilege but requiring constant vigilance against losing that privilege. Now let's talk about the tipping policy, because this one perfectly captures the bizarre class dynamics at play. The rule, stated in various ways across different clubs, is essentially this: club servants should not be tipped. Instead, there's usually a holiday box on the mantelpiece or in a conspicuous location where members can place contributions. These are pooled and distributed to staff at Christmas or other appropriate times. On the surface, this seems egalitarian. No playing favourites, everyone contributes to a common fund, staff receive equal shares. But think about what it really means. You're forbidden from directly rewarding good service or showing appreciation to specific staff members. Everything must flow through the official channel. It's another way of maintaining distance, of ensuring that the relationship between members and staff remains purely institutional rather than personal. God forbid you develop an actual human connection with the person who's served you dinner every week for 10 years. The mobile phone ban is a recent addition to club rules, but it's enforced with the same severity as centuries-old traditions. At most traditional clubs, you're required to leave your mobile phone in your locker or check it at the door. Using a phone in public areas is grounds for reprimand. Some clubs have designated phone rooms where you can make calls, but these are usually small, uncomfortable spaces that make it clear you're engaging in unsavoury behaviour. The stated reason is preserving the peaceful atmosphere, but here's what it really does. It cuts you off from the outside world. Your boss can't reach you, your spouse can't call, your children can't text. For the duration of your club visit, you're unreachable, unaccountable, free from the demands of modern life. It's temporal isolation, being in London in 2025 but living like it's 1925, at least for a few hours. The irony is that many members check their phones constantly the moment they leave the building. They're not actually disconnecting from technology, they're performing disconnection for each other. Look at us, so sophisticated we don't need phones. Meanwhile, their assistants are frantically trying to reach them about urgent matters. But urgency has no meaning inside the club. The club operates on its own schedule, its own priorities, and the outside world can wait. Let me tell you about the rule that prohibits laptops and work-related papers in certain clubs. You can bring a book, preferably something respectable like history or biography. You can bring a newspaper, though it should be a proper newspaper like the Times or the Telegraph, not a tabloid. But a laptop? Work documents? Absolutely not. Because those items signal that you're working, and working signals that you need to work, which signals that you're not wealthy enough to avoid working. This is class performance at its most explicit. Wealthy people work, of course. Many club members have demanding careers, but at the club you perform leisure. You perform having so much time and money that work is optional. Even if you're stressed about a deadline, even if you're worried about a business deal, you sit in the library with your newspaper and pretend life is effortless. The club is a stage, and the performance is man with no concerns. The pay your club bills before any other debt rule deserves special attention because it reveals the club's priorities with crystalline clarity. A 19th century guide states, "A gentleman always pays his club bills and mess bills before any other debt at the risk of social ruin." Notice that order. Club bills first, then everything else, mortgage, business loans, family obligations. Because failing to pay the butcher might be unfortunate, but failing to pay your club fees is unforgivable. This rule led to the perverse situation where men would fall behind on rent, dismiss servants, even neglect family needs to ensure their club fees were current. Because without the club you lose access to the network that makes everything else possible. The club isn't just a luxury, it's infrastructure. Letting your membership lapse is career suicide, social suicide, actual suicide in some historical cases. So you pay the club no matter what. There's a rule about not waking sleeping members that we touched on earlier, but it extends beyond just the library. Throughout the club, if someone is asleep in a chair, on the sofa, even on the floor in one documented case, you are not to disturb them. You walk around them. You speak quietly near them. You let them rest regardless of how long they've been sleeping or how inconveniently positioned they've become. This rule has led to members sleeping through entire evenings, missing dinner, waking disoriented at midnight in a dark club with confused night staff. The never discuss religion or politics rule is honoured, more in the breach than the observance, but it technically exists. Given that many clubs were explicitly founded along political lines, White's for Tories, Brooks's for Whigs, the Reform Club for Liberals, this rule is absurd on its face. But the intent is to prevent serious arguments that might disrupt the convivial atmosphere. You can hold political views, you can even discuss them, but you can't argue passionately or take genuine offence. Politics must remain a game, not a matter of sincere conviction. This creates a strange detachment where club members might vote on legislation affecting millions of lives, but inside the club, those decisions are discussed as abstract intellectual exercises. The human consequences of policy become footnotes to clever debate. It's how you end up with men making life and death decisions over port while treating those decisions as entertaining thought experiments. The club rules enforce emotional distance from real-world impact. Let's talk about the dress code violations we haven't covered yet, because some of these are beautifully specific. At certain clubs, wearing brown shoes with a blue suit is technically acceptable during the day but frowned upon in the evening. Why? Nobody can articulate a reason. It's just understood that evening formality requires black shoes. Brown suggests casualness, and casualness suggests you don't take the evening seriously, which suggests you don't take the club seriously, which suggests you don't really belong. Or consider the rule about buttoning your jacket. You're expected to leave the bottom button undone, always. If you button all the buttons on a 2-button or 3-button jacket, you've committed a faux pas. The origin of this rule supposedly dates to King Edward VII, who was too rotund to button his bottom button, so courtiers left theirs undone in solidarity. Whether that's true or apocryphal doesn't matter. What matters is that over a century later, men are still following a rule based on one king's waistline. The newspaper hierarchy in club reading rooms reflects class obsessions in miniature. The Times goes on the table at the front of the room, positioned prominently. The Telegraph and Financial Times are nearby. The Guardian and Independent are available, but position less prominently. Tabloids like The Sun or Daily Mail might be available, but they're tucked away almost apologetically, and reading them openly marks you as having questionable taste. The spatial arrangement of newspapers becomes a daily reminder of which opinions are respectable and which are not. Some clubs have rules about the order in which you can sit in chairs, not official rules exactly, but understandings. Certain chairs are reserved for senior members, not by age, by seniority of membership. A 70-year-old who joined last year defers to a 50-year-old who's been a member for 30 years. The 50-year-old gets the better chair by the fire. You learn these hierarchies through trial and error, usually by sitting somewhere you shouldn't and being politely informed that old Johnson usually sits there. The rule about not introducing yourself to other members is particularly strange. If you don't know another member, you're not supposed to walk up and introduce yourself. You wait to be formally introduced by a mutual acquaintance. This can lead to situations where you're sitting next to someone at dinner eating in silence because no one's around to perform introductions. The assumption is that if you're both members, you should already know each other, or someone should have already introduced you. Taking initiative suggests you're pushy, which suggests you might not be quite the right sort. Here's a rule I love for its sheer pettiness. At some clubs, you're not supposed to read over someone's shoulder. If another member is reading a newspaper or book, you shouldn't position yourself where you can see what they're reading, even accidentally. This protects privacy, yes, but it also creates an atmosphere of constant spatial awareness. You're always calculating angles, ensuring you're not inadvertently invading someone's reading space. It turns a simple act, sitting in a chair, into a complex negotiation of unwritten boundaries. The contradiction at the heart of all these rules is that they claim to create freedom through structure. The clubs argue that by having clear rules, members know what to expect and can truly relax. But in reality, the rules create constant low-level anxiety. Are you sitting in the right chair, wearing the right shoes, reading the right newspaper, following the protocol that everyone else seems to understand intuitively, but nobody ever explains explicitly? It's freedom that feels suspiciously like restriction. What's remarkable is how seriously these rules are taken despite their obvious absurdity. Grown men, accomplished in their fields, will stress about whether their tie is appropriate or whether they've committed some obscure breach of etiquette. The rules work because everyone agrees to pretend they matter. It's collective delusion raised to institutional policy. And honestly, there's something almost admirable about that level of commitment to meaningless tradition. As you drift towards sleep, consider the rules that govern your own life. How many of them are actually necessary versus just inherited tradition? How many things do you do because they're required versus because that's how it's always been done? The gentlemen's clubs, in all their absurdity, are really just an extreme version of something we all do. Follow rules we don't fully understand because questioning them feels more difficult than compliance. But while the rules are absurd, they pale in comparison to the scandals. Because behind all these regulations, all these protocols, all this performance of propriety, these clubs have hosted some spectacularly ungentlemanly behaviour. The gap between what the clubs claim to be and what actually happens inside them opens up a whole new dimension of hypocrisy worth exploring. Imagine the scene. It's 2002, and the chairman of Boodle's Club, one of London's most prestigious establishments, founded in 1762, is standing in court admitting to defrauding his own club of £4 million. £4 million, not to fund some elaborate criminal enterprise or lavish lifestyle, to cover his investment losses and pay his club membership fees. The man responsible for stewarding one of Britain's most respected institutions had been stealing from it for years to maintain the illusion that he could afford to remain a member The irony is so perfect it hurts. He stole from the club to pay the club. This is the reality behind the gentleman's club facade. For every story of dignified tradition and refined behaviour, there's a matching story of fraud, scandal, blackmail, and spectacular hypocrisy. The gap between what these institutions claim to represent and what actually happens inside them is so vast you could lose entire fortunes in it. And people have. Let's start with the gambling scandals, because they go back to the club's very origins. We've talked about the betting book and its absurd wagers, but we haven't fully addressed the human cost. The clubs weren't just enabling gambling, they were normalising financial suicide. Take Beau Brummel, the fashion arbiter we discussed earlier. His downfall wasn't fashion-related, it was gambling debts. He recorded his final bet in Boodle's betting book right before fleeing London to escape creditors. That last bet was essentially his goodbye note, a final performance of nonchalance before disappearing into exile. Or consider Sir John Bland, whose story we touched on briefly. In a single sitting at Brooks's, he lost £32,000, roughly $3 million in today's money. Horace Walpole, the 18th century writer and historian, documented what happened next. Bland had flirted away his whole fortune and was facing complete financial ruin. Rather than face the shame, he shot himself on the road from Calais to Paris. A man chose death over admitting to his peers that he had gambled away everything, and the club's response? They recorded the incident, shook their heads about the tragedy, and continued gambling. The phrase flirted away that Walpole uses is telling. Flirting suggests something playful, almost charming. But Bland didn't flirt away his fortune. He destroyed his life in rooms specifically designed to make destruction feel sophisticated. The clubs dressed up addiction in leather chairs and crystal brandy snifters, making self-destruction look like gentlemanly recreation. They were enablers with excellent interior design. Now let's talk about the Brooks hot air balloon sex bet, because this story is so outrageous it sounds fictional. After a particularly lavish dinner at Brooks's in the late 1700s, an earl bet a duke 500 guineas, roughly $50,000 today, that the duke couldn't have sexual intercourse with a woman 1,000 yards up in a hot air balloon. Just process that for a moment. These supposedly refined gentlemen sat around after dinner, and someone's mind went to, I bet you can't have sex in a hot air balloon. The Duke accepted the bet. Documentation of whether he actually attempted it is murky. Hot air balloon operators weren't exactly keeping detailed logs of their customers' activities, but the fact that this bet was recorded in writing, discussed openly, and considered a legitimate wager tells you everything about the moral standards at these clubs. They'd police your trouser buttons and shoe choices with obsessive fervour. But betting on aerial sexual gymnastics was perfectly acceptable gentlemanly behaviour. The East India Club deserves special attention for its scandal management strategy. When we mentioned earlier that their treasurer embezzled £500,000, I glossed over the truly shocking part. The club's priority wasn't justice or accountability, it was discretion. They didn't want to prosecute because prosecution meant publicity, and publicity meant scrutiny, and scrutiny might reveal all sorts of other questionable activities. Better to quietly absorb the loss, quietly dismiss the treasurer, and quietly pretend nothing happened. This happened in the 21st century, not the 19th. These weren't medieval lords operating outside the law. These were modern British gentlemen choosing to prioritise reputation over justice. The treasurer who stole £500,000 faced no criminal charges. He simply stopped being a member. The club's discretion extended even to criminals, as long as they were the right sort of criminals. But the East India Club's scandals didn't stop at embezzlement. There was also the blackmail incident involving a British Member of Parliament who claimed parliamentary expenses to stay at the club during an extramarital affair. When a colleague discovered the affair, he attempted to blackmail the MP by filming him leaving the club with his mistress. The situation eventually became public, but what's remarkable is how many layers of rule-breaking were involved. The affair itself, the fraudulent expense claims, the blackmail attempt, and throughout it all, the club maintained its discretion. Nobody from the club commented publicly. The club's role was never officially acknowledged. The code of silence held even when members were committing crimes against each other. Women entering through the back door at the East India Club isn't just a metaphor. It was literal policy. Female guests had to use a separate entrance, presumably so members wouldn't have to acknowledge women's presence in the main hallways. Can you imagine the mindset required to create that policy? We'll tolerate women visiting, but they must enter like servants or deliveries, not like actual people who deserve to use the front door. And this policy existed well into the late 20th century, defended as maintaining tradition and dignity. The Claremont Club, founded in 1962 by John Aspinall, deserves mention because it made other clubs look almost restrained. Aspinall was an eccentric millionaire who also owned a private zoo, and he designed the Claremont as a casino for the super-rich. During the swinging 60s, the club became legendary for high-stakes gambling that made Whites and Brookses look positively modest. We're talking about single hands of cards worth tens of millions in today's money. The clientele included actors, politicians, and royalty, all gambling with money that could have fed entire towns. Aspinall himself was apparently indifferent to whether he won or lost. The thrill was in creating a space where Britain's elite could gamble without limit or judgment. The Claremont was the logical conclusion of club culture taken to its extreme, a place where the only rule was that there were no limits as long as you could afford the losses. Let me tell you about the political scandals that emerged from these clubs, because they reveal how business and politics mixed despite the no business discussion rules. Edward Ellis, a 19th century Whig Member of Parliament, famously declared that Britain had a system of club government. He wasn't exaggerating. More policy decisions were made in the smoking rooms of Brookses and the Reform Club than in the House of Commons. The clubs were where ministers consulted with business leaders, where parliamentary votes were arranged, where careers were made or broken. This created obvious corruption opportunities. If you wanted favourable legislation for your industry, you needed club access to the men making decisions. If you wanted a government contract, you needed to be at the right dinner table at the right club. The entire system ran on networks formed and maintained in these supposedly apolitical social spaces. The clubs claimed they forbade business discussions while simultaneously serving as the primary venues where British business happened. Constitutional crises were negotiated at clubs. The 1910 to 1911 Constitutional Crisis, when the House of Lords' powers were being curtailed, nearly tore apart the social fabric of clubland. Members who'd been friends for decades stopped speaking because they were on opposite sides of the constitutional question. Some clubs saw their membership split along political lines so severely that men would refuse to dine if certain other members were present. The clubs prided themselves on being above politics, but when political tensions reached a boiling point, that pretense evaporated. Sexual scandals were handled with remarkable efficiency at the clubs. They were simply never discussed. If a member was caught in an affair, if someone's marriage collapsed due to infidelity, if there were whispers about inappropriate behaviour, none of it was acknowledged openly. The clubs operated on a "what happens here stays here" principle that would make Las Vegas jealous. This wasn't about protecting privacy, it was about protecting privilege. As long as scandals stayed quiet, members could continue their lives without consequence. This code of silence extended to protecting genuinely predatory behaviour. Without naming specific individuals, because many cases never became public, There are documented instances of members using club connections to cover up financial impropriety, to suppress embarrassing personal information, to avoid accountability for behavior that would ruin anyone without club protection. The network of mutual discretion became a shield against consequences. The bankruptcy scandals were particularly rich in irony. Club rules required members to pay their dues promptly, but numerous members over the years have faced financial catastrophe while maintaining club membership until the very end. The logic was that keeping up appearances mattered more than actual solvency. Better to go bankrupt maintaining your club membership than resign and admit you can't afford it. This led to the perverse spectacle of men selling family heirlooms to pay club fees while telling themselves they were preserving their position. Divorce cases involving club members often revealed the extent to which the club served as escape from family life. Wives would testify in court that their husbands spent more time at their clubs than at home, that club dinners took priority over family events, that the clubs fostered a culture where domestic responsibilities were seen as burdensome rather than important. The club's defense was always that they merely provided facilities. What members did with those facilities wasn't their concern. But when you create a space specifically designed to help men avoid their families, you can't claim innocence when marriages fail. Let me tell you about the drunkenness, because it was endemic and deliberately ignored. The club served alcohol all day. Members would start with sherry at noon, wine with lunch, port in the afternoon, cocktails in the evening, more wine with dinner, brandy after dinner. Consuming enough alcohol to incapacitate a normal person was considered unremarkable. The clubs even had systems for dealing with extremely intoxicated members. Staff would quietly help them to rooms to sleep it off or pour them into taxis with instructions for the driver. The drinking culture wasn't just tolerated, it was celebrated. Members would compete to show they could drink vast quantities while remaining functional. Getting blackout drunk at lunch was a minor faux pas, but getting drunk at dinner was basically expected. The clubs created an environment where alcoholism could flourish unchallenged because admitting someone had a drinking problem would require acknowledging that club culture contributed to that problem. There's a documented case of a member who fell asleep drunk in a club library and wasn't discovered for 2 days. 2 days. He'd wedged himself behind a bookshelf in a corner that wasn't regularly cleaned, and nobody noticed his absence because members came and went without announcing themselves. When he was finally discovered, disoriented and dehydrated, the club's response was to ensure he was medically treated and to tighten their room-checking procedures. They didn't question why a member could go missing for 48 hours without anyone noticing. The violence that occasionally erupted at clubs is less documented because it was aggressively suppressed, but it happened. Gentlemen's clubs were supposed to be havens of civility, but put enough drunk aristocrats in a confined space and disagreements turned physical. Arguments over card games led to shoving matches. Political disputes became near brawls. The clubs dealt with this by pretending it never happened, cleaning up any damage, separating the combatants, and ensuring nobody outside the club learned about it. Suicide at clubs was more common than you'd think, though it's rarely acknowledged in official histories. Men facing financial ruin, scandal, or personal crisis would sometimes take their own lives in their club rooms, the one place where they'd felt safe, the sanctuary they couldn't bear to leave. The clubs would quietly handle these tragedies, informing families, coordinating with authorities, and then never speaking of it again. The code of discretion extended even to death. What strikes me most about these scandals is how they reveal the fundamental hypocrisy of club culture. These institutions presented themselves as guardians of standards, bastions of propriety, examples of civilized behavior. But beneath that polished surface was addiction, fraud, exploitation and moral bankruptcy. The clubs weren't escapes from society's problems. They were pressure cookers that intensified those problems while hiding them from public view. And yet, the club survived. Despite embezzlement, despite gambling-related suicides, despite documented wrongdoing, the traditional clubs are still operating in 2025. The scandals didn't destroy them because the scandals were features, not bugs. The ability to absorb scandal, to protect members from consequences, to maintain discretion no matter what, that was part of the appeal. You join these clubs not despite their moral flexibility, but because of it. As you think about falling asleep tonight, consider how institutions protect themselves by protecting their members. The clubs understood something profound about power. If everyone has dirt on everyone else, and everyone agrees to stay quiet, the whole system becomes unassailable. Mutual discretion about mutual wrongdoing creates a bond stronger than friendship. It creates complicity. But while these scandals reveal the darkness beneath club culture, they're also ending points, moments when the clubs failed to live up to their own ideals. To truly understand what these institutions have become in the modern era, we need to look at how they've survived into a world that increasingly questions whether such exclusive spaces should exist at all. Because the last bastions of club culture are fighting for survival, and their strategies for staying relevant reveal just as much about human nature as their absurd traditions ever did. So here we are in 2025, and something remarkable has happened to London's gentlemen's clubs. Most of them have vanished into history. At the height of their influence in the late 19th century, London boasted over 400 of these establishments. Today, only about 40 traditional clubs remain. That's a 90% extinction rate. The dinosaurs had better survival odds. And yet, those 40 clubs that remain are fighting fiercely for their continued existence, employing strategies that range from genuine adaptation to stubborn defiance to creative reinvention of what a club even means. Let's start with the holdouts. The 8 clubs still refusing to admit women as full members. Whites, Brookses, Boodles, Bucks, the Travellers Club, the Beefsteak Club, Pratt's, and the East India Club. These institutions have collectively decided that maintaining their male-only tradition is worth whatever criticism, controversy, and declining relevance comes with it. They have looked at the 21st century and said, "No thank you, we'll stay in 1850. But here's what's fascinating. This strategy might actually be working for them, at least financially. White's still has a 9-year waiting list. Brookses and Boodles continue to attract wealthy members despite, or perhaps because of, their refusal to modernise. The exclusivity that makes them controversial also makes them desirable to a specific demographic. Men who want access to one of the few remaining spaces where they can pretend the modern world doesn't exist. The membership fees at these holdout clubs reveal their business model. White's doesn't publish its fees publicly, but estimates suggest around £10,000 for initial entry and £5,000 annually. That's roughly $12,000 entrance and $6,000 per year. For that money, you get access to a building you might not find space in, food you could cook better at home, and the privilege of following rules designed to make your life more difficult. Objectively, it's terrible value. But exclusivity has never been about objective value. What White's and its fellow holdouts understand is that they're not selling amenities, they're selling identity. When you tell someone you're a member of White's, you're communicating something specific. I'm wealthy enough to afford membership, connected enough to be proposed and seconded, patient enough to wait years for admission, and traditional enough to belong to a male-only institution despite knowing it's controversial. That's a lot of signalling packed into one membership card. The clubs of admitted women have taken varied approaches to survival. The Reform Club, first to admit women back in 1981, has leaned into its progressive reputation. They market themselves as the thinking person's club, attracting members interested in politics, literature, and social reform. Their library is genuinely impressive. Their lecture series brings in notable speakers, and their mixed-gender membership feels relatively normal rather than grudging. The Athenaeum, which admitted women in 2002, has positioned itself as the club for academics and intellectuals. Scientists, artists, writers, and scholars make up much of their membership. They've essentially said, if you care about intellectual achievement more than gender, we're your club. It's worked reasonably well, their membership remains strong, and they've avoided the controversy plaguing male-only clubs while maintaining enough exclusivity to feel special. But these traditionally male clubs, whether they admit women or not, face competition from a completely different species. Modern private members clubs like Soho House, the Groucho Club, 5 Hertford Street, and Shoreditch House. These new establishments have taken the club concept and completely reimagined it for the 21st century. They're stylish where the old clubs are stuffy. They're commercially run rather than member-owned. They welcome women not grudgingly but enthusiastically. And most importantly, they're actually fun. Soho House deserves special attention because it's basically the anti-whites. Founded in 1995, it now has locations in cities around the world. Members skew younger, creative, and international. The dress code is smart casual, which actually means casual. Jeans are fine, trainers are acceptable, nobody's checking your trouser buttons. There's Wi-Fi throughout. You can use your phone. You can work on your laptop. You can even, gasp, discuss business. The food at Soho House is genuinely good because they hire actual chefs who care about flavour rather than tradition. The atmosphere is relaxed and social rather than formal and isolating. And here's the revolutionary part. Membership is based on whether you're interesting rather than whether you're wealthy. They prioritise creative professionals, film, media, fashion, art over bankers and lawyers. You can't buy your way in if you're boring. This represents an existential threat to traditional clubs. Why would a 35-year-old entrepreneur wait 9 years for whites when they can join Soho House immediately? Why would a young professional tolerate outdated rules when they can network in spaces designed for how people actually work today? The traditional clubs offer history and prestige, but the modern clubs offer relevance and functionality. It's not an easy choice. Some traditional clubs have attempted to modernize while maintaining their character. They've added business centers with computers and meeting rooms. They've improved their dining to compete with restaurants. They have created reciprocal agreements with clubs in other cities, allowing members to stay at partner clubs when traveling. These are sensible adaptations, but they're also admissions that the old model alone isn't sufficient anymore. The real challenge facing traditional clubs is demographic. Their core membership, upper-class British men aged 55 and above, is literally dying off. Each year, more members exit through death than enter through election. The younger generation, even wealthy ones from appropriate backgrounds, are less interested. They've grown up in a more diverse, less deferential world. The idea of belonging to a club that excludes women or enforces arbitrary rules strikes them as embarrassing rather than prestigious. I spoke with a 32-year-old investment banker whose father is a member of Brooks's. The father keeps suggesting his son apply for membership. The son keeps declining. When I asked why, he said, "What's the appeal? I'd pay thousands of pounds to eat bad food, follow pointless rules, and be associated with an institution that's obviously on the wrong side of history. My friends would mock me, not envy me. The whole thing feels like cosplay for privilege." That quote should terrify the traditional clubs because it represents their future, or lack thereof. But here's something unexpected. Some young people are joining traditional clubs precisely because they're anachronisms. There's a hipster irony thing happening where belonging to a fusty old institution becomes a form of counterculture rebellion. When everyone your age is at trendy bars and modern clubs, being the one guy who goes to Brooks's for spotted dick becomes a personality trait. It's retro in the same way vinyl records are retro, objectively inferior but aesthetically interesting. This creates a strange situation where the clubs are simultaneously dying and being discovered by a new generation. The numbers don't lie. Membership is declining, waiting lists are shorter than they used to be, and several clubs have quietly reduced their entrance fees to attract new members. But within that decline, there's a small subgroup keeping the tradition alive through ironic appreciation and genuine fascination with history. The financial model of member-owned clubs has always been precarious. Unlike commercial ventures that can adjust prices and services based on market demand, these clubs are constrained by their own rules and traditions. They can't simply raise fees dramatically without losing members. They can't cut costs by reducing service quality without undermining what makes them special. They exist in a narrow economic band where they're simultaneously too expensive for most people and not profitable enough to sustain themselves long term. Several clubs have sold their buildings or portions thereof to remain solvent. The real estate they occupy, prime locations in central London, is worth more than the clubs themselves. This creates perverse incentives where the land is more valuable empty than occupied by the club. Some clubs have survived by selling ground floor space to commercial tenants while maintaining upper floors for club use. It works financially, but feels like defeat. Your exclusive sanctuary now shares a building with a bank or retail shop. The question facing all these clubs is fundamentally, what are they for in the modern world? In the 18th and 19th centuries, they served clear purposes. Gambling venues when gambling was illegal elsewhere, political organising spaces, network building centres for men who controlled commerce and government. But in 2025, you can gamble online legally. Political organising happens on social media. Business networks form on LinkedIn. The original functions have been replaced by technology and social change. What remains is something harder to quantify. Atmosphere, history, continuity, tradition, belonging. These are real values, but they're not unique to gentlemen's clubs. Any community organisation, religious congregation or social group can provide them. The club's competitive advantage was always exclusivity, but exclusivity becomes less appealing when what you're being excluded from doesn't seem worth joining anyway. There's also the uncomfortable question of whether these institutions should survive. They were built on and sustained by exclusion of women, of the working class, of anyone deemed unsuitable by arbitrary standards. Their traditions include practices we now recognize as harmful, from enabling gambling addiction to protecting wrongdoers through discretion. Preserving them means preserving structures that caused real damage to real people. Is historical continuity worth that moral cost? But I'm also struck by something more nuanced. These clubs, for all their flaws, created spaces where human connection happened in ways we're struggling to replicate. They forced people to interact face-to-face, to share meals, to build relationships over years and decades. They created third places, not home, not work, but somewhere else where community formed. The modern world is losing third places, and we're discovering that digital connection doesn't quite replace physical proximity. Maybe what we need isn't to preserve gentlemen's clubs as they exist, but to learn from them while discarding their worst elements. Keep the idea of dedicated social spaces. Keep the concept of communities built around shared values. Keep the notion that people need places to gather beyond home and office, but discard the exclusion. Discard the arbitrary rules designed to humiliate. Discard the enabling of destructive behaviour. Keep the leather chairs but lose the misogyny. Some of the modern clubs are attempting exactly this. They're creating inclusive versions of club culture, spaces with membership requirements and shared etiquette, but without the baggage of gender exclusion or class warfare. It's early days, but the experiment is interesting. Can you have club culture without club snobbery? Can you create belonging without creating out-groups? The jury's still out. As we come to the end of our journey through this strange world tonight, I want you to think about what these clubs ultimately represent. On one level, they're ridiculous. Grown men eating children's food, sleeping under newspapers, wagering fortunes on raindrops, and enforcing rules about trouser buttons. The absurdity is undeniable. But on another level, they're very human. They're about people trying to create spaces where they feel safe, comfortable, understood. They're about the need for belonging, for tradition, for continuity in a changing world. The silly traditions, calling everyone George, sleeping under newspapers, eating spotted dick. These aren't bugs in the system, they're features. They're what creates shared identity. When you and your fellow members all follow the same ridiculous traditions, you bond over the shared absurdity. The traditions work precisely because they're meaningless. If they had real purpose, they'd be obligations. Because they're purposeless, they're choices you make to signal belonging. What gentlemen's clubs teach us is that humans will create elaborate rituals around almost anything if those rituals provide identity and community. The specific content doesn't matter. It could be about chocolate houses or napping traditions or dress codes. What matters is that you're in and others are out, that you know the unwritten rules, that you're part of something exclusive. We all do this in different ways. The gentlemen's clubs are just more honest about it, more elaborate in their execution, and more willing to look ridiculous in the process. So as you finally drift off to sleep tonight, maybe you'll dream about bow windows and betting books, about spotted dick and chamber pots, about black balls and George, or maybe you'll just appreciate that wherever you are, whatever communities you belong to, at least nobody's making you eat nursery food in a basement while wearing a tie. The gentlemen's clubs set the bar for absurdity remarkably high, and most of us, thankfully, live well below it. Thank you for staying with me through this entire journey into the wonderfully strange world of London's gentlemen's clubs. I hope you found it as fascinating as I do. These institutions that are simultaneously important and ridiculous, influential and absurd, historical treasures and embarrassing relics. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the silly side of serious traditions, you know what to do. Leave your thoughts in the comments, share this with anyone who appreciates historical absurdity, and stay tuned for the next story. Because history is full of people doing bizarre things with complete seriousness, and I can't wait to explore more of it with you. Sleep well, and remember, no matter how strange your day was, at least you didn't spend it sitting in a window judging strangers' cravats.